power shines. But what happens when that power is stacked in layers upon layers of durasteel towers reaching so high that the original ground has been buried for thousands of years? The answer is Coruscant, the galactic city-planet whose glittering nightside seems to promise order light and endless motion from orbit. The world is a tapestry of traffic lanes and glowing sky lanes, a crown of civilization wrapped around a quiet, dark core. Yet the story of Coruscant is not only written in those shining spires, it is also written in everything buried beneath them. On the surface, senators debate in luminous halls. Jedi once walked marble corridors, and starships glide between polished landing platforms. This is the image of safety, the heart of the Republic, beating in perfect rhythm. But what lies beneath those lights, beneath the Jedi Temple and the Senate Dome, beneath the entertainment districts of Uskru and the tidy plazas of Cocoa Town, over time construction has risen higher and higher until the true ground level fell out of sight. Entire neighborhoods were entombed under new foundations. Streets became ceilings, and sunlight vanished behind ferrocrete and transparent steel. In those hidden levels, power is decided in different ways. There are no grand speeches, only whispered deals in shadowed markets, where spice changes hands and stolen data cores flicker in the dark. The Force still moves there, but it is felt in quiet acts of survival and in the tension of constant conflict. Criminal empires from Black Sun to the Hutt cartels extend their reach into cramped corridors, while local gangs carve out territory, one alley at a time. What followed was a second city. Beneath the first, a labyrinth of forgotten infrastructure, and lives lived permanently out of the sun. If Coruscant is the heart of the Republic, what does it mean that this heart is built on strata of darkness, crime and buried history, layer after layer of abandoned transit tunnels, sealed maintenance shafts, and collapsed housing? Blocks form a kind of archaeological cross-section of galactic ambition. The Works District rumbles with aging machinery above, while industrial depths below it echo with failing generators and illegal power taps. Ghost levels where numbers blur or vanish altogether mark places the authorities no longer map or patrol. This descent has a beginning and an end, and tonight it will unfold in order from the first foundations carved into the planet's bedrock, when Coruscant was still a world of open skies and natural caves, through the early underlevels left behind by each new wave of construction past infamous zones, such as Level 1, 313, once heavy industrial, now a haven for bounty hunters and syndicates, and finally into the mythic depths where official records fail, and only rumor remains. What they found that would change everything for those who dared to go down. What follows is a calm, guided fall through that entire underworld, a documentary, bedtime story, moving layer by layer, district by district and level by level. The pace will be steady, the tone soft. Even as the environments grow more dangerous, from neon alleys to pitch-black caverns, the journey is meant to be heard, while drifting towards sleep, carried along by the quiet realization that beneath every light on Coruscant, there is a shadow, and beneath every tower, there is another forgotten floor. From temple spires to traffic lanes, orienting the vertical world. From that thought, the descent begins to make sense, because Coruscant is not truly a city on a planet. It is a planet that has become a city for thousands of years. Layer upon layer of construction has buried the original crust beneath ferrocrete foundations, transit grids, and forgotten habitats. The shining surface that most visitors imagine when they think of Coruscant is only the newest skin stretched over an ancient mechanical skeleton. In broad terms, the vertical world of Coruscant can be imagined as three great bands. At the very top are the open air, levels where skylanes braid between towers and the sky itself is still visible. Here, the Senate District, the Jedi Temple spires, and the gleaming towers of the wealthy form a ceremonial crown. This is the image preserved in galactic holodramas, endless streams of speeders flowing between polished facades, suspended high above any thought of ground beneath that crown. The mid-levels form deep, artificial canyons of durasteel and transparasteel, where the sky narrows to a strip. and the light is filtered through struts and walkways. Here, residential blocks, commercial plazas and transit hubs pressed together in dense strata. What followed was a slow compression of life into vertical corridors, bridges and maintenance ducts. Whole communities adapted to a world where the horizon is a wall, and the sun appears only as a reflection in distant windows. Far below those canyons, the lower levels begin. The air grows heavy. The hum of traffic gives way to the constant thrum of machinery, and natural light fades, or into memory. This is where official oversight thins out, where the Force feels muted by distance and metal, and where the boundary between the lawful city and the underworld blurs, in practice, more than in law over time. Neglected industrial decks, abandoned freight yards, and sealed infrastructure, merged into a continuous twilight realm. To navigate all of this, Coruscant uses level numbers and sectors. Each tower stack and platform is assigned a level designation, running up and down from notional zero. Yet these numbers are only approximations. Centuries of collapse, reconstruction, and repurposing have twisted the grid. Some levels have buckled into those below. Others have been walled off, leaving misaligned floors and echoing shafts. The result is a patchwork of ghost levels, places that exist in record but no longer match any clean physical layer. Even the most polished districts rest on forgotten foundations. Beneath the Senate's marble plazas lie ancient transit conduits and obsolete power. Relays below the Jedi Temple's serene courtyards are pre-Republic foundations and the remnants of earlier fortifications. Every luxury tower stands on subfloors that once housed factories, worker barracks, or early skyhook anchors. The story of the skyline is inseparable from the buried labor that holds it in place. Seen this way, the underworld is more than a criminal refuge. It is an archaeological record of galactic history, preserved in stacked layers of outdated technology and abandoned neighborhoods in the deepest strata. Ancient ruins and even natural caverns still survive wedged between reactor housings and support pylons. What they found there would change everything for historians, scavengers, and those who listen to the whispers of the dark side. For the next 1,000 years, these layers would shape the destinies of those who dared to descend, and the next step is to enter them level by level. The first foundations, bedrock, sinkholes, and buried seas. To understand those first steps downward, it helps to remember that Coruscant was not always a seamless ocean of durasteel. There was a time when wind moved freely between mountain peaks and real seas reflected unbroken starlight, long before the Jedi Temple crowned the skyline, and long before the Senate spoke for the galactic core. The world that would become the Republic's capital was a rugged sphere of stonewater and weather in the earliest eras before full urbanization. Ancient polities, and then the nascent Republic, made a brutal bargain with the planet itself. Mountains were leveled to clear flight paths and construction zones, entire ranges ground down into aggregate to feed the foundations of future megastructures. Lowland seas were drained, redirected, or roofed over until their surfaces vanished beneath ferrocrete decks. The natural crust was peeled back again and again, exposing raw bedrock, so that the first true city towers could anchor themselves directly into the planet's spine. That decision would shape everything built above and everything hidden below. Once the bedrock lay bare, engineers and planetary architects began the slow excavation that created the first real underworld they carved. Enormous support caverns to house load-bearing pylons and repulsor counterweights, bored transit tunnels for early maglev lines, and dug broad utility conduits for water pressure mains, power trunks, and atmospheric processors. What followed was a lattice of hollow spaces running beneath every district, a stone skeleton wrapped in metal arteries intended to remain unseen and unremembered by the surface. Over time, those works met the stubborn reality of geology. Coruscant's crust flexed under the weight of growing superstructures, faults slipped, and entire districts experienced subsidence. In some regions, the ground simply gave way. Sinkholes yawned open where underground caverns intersected. Natural weaknesses, swallowing plazas, transit nodes, and early habitation blocks, Engineers responded by spanning these new chasms with bridges decking them over and then building again on top. But the scars remained vertical shafts and irregular voids plunging through multiple strata. Quiet reminders that the planet beneath the city still possessed its own power. These scars became anchors for elevator cores, ventilation stacks, and emergency shafts linking distant levels in narrow columns of stale air and flickering light. In some places, ancient drainage tunnels now hung exposed along the walls of man-made abysses, dripping condensation into darkness. In others, abandoned sea basins were repurposed as vast subsurface reservoirs, their original shores now lost behind retaining walls and machinery. The story of Coruscant's depths at this stage was not crime nor decay, but function. Every passage had a purpose. The earliest underworld was a realm of maintenance crews, drones and droids, not smugglers and syndicates. Sewage and water systems pulsed through pressure tubes thicker than starships' power relays, hummed in cavernous switchyards. Atmospheric recyclers throbbed behind armored bulkheads, and cargo routes threaded between them, bringing raw materials up from orbital tethers and down from surface ports. It was designed so that most citizens would never see it, so that the light side and the dark side of galactic politics could play out far above, without noticing the machinery that sustained them. Yet as each era reached higher and demanded new layers of infrastructure, the old grids were rarely erased. They were simply bypassed, sealed off, or forgotten. Whole sections of conduit were left pressurized, but unmonitored early transit lines were entombed behind newer tunnels. Support caverns were reinforced once and then ignored for thousands of years. In those abandoned pockets, the hum of the city softened into a constant distant murmur space, open for other things to move in, for life to adapt in the shadows, and for those seeking hidden power to claim territory. No census acknowledged somewhere. Below the last mapped level, one more access hatch waits, rusted half open, and the next descent will show what grew in the dark when no one was watching. Layer upon layer, how a city buries its own past. That next descent does not only move through space, it moves through time. Power on Coruscant is not just measured in credits or blaster strength, but in altitude. Every meter upward means more light, more attention, more protection, and every meter downward means one more layer of history, quietly sealed away in the earliest days of a district. The story of that space begins in triumph. A new platform opens on some mid-range level, its durasteel still bright, its transparent steel windows clear. It hosts ministries of a young republic or glittering apartment towers for senatorial aides. For a few centuries it thrives. Pedestrian plazas, busy with speeders and hollows, its name spoken in the Senate as an example of successful urban planning. What followed was an era in which that level feels central, irreplaceable. The future of the city over time construction permits and investment drift upward. A new transit spine is approved, a few dozen levels above new support pylons sink down through the old plazas, casting long shadows. At first, the change seems minor. Traffic patterns adjust. One major skyway is rerouted to a higher ring. A maglev station closes for renovation, but never quite reopens. Gradually, the official maps emphasize the higher junctions, and the old thoroughfares fall off the main schematics as zoning shifts. The infrastructure follows. Power conduits are upgraded above, while older grids remain, but only as backups. Water and air recyclers on the upper levels receive new filters and redundancies. The lower systems keep running because shutting them down would be inconvenient, not because anyone defends them. Patrol routes of the Coruscant Security Force favor the bright new promenades, leaving the older streets technically within jurisdiction, but rarely visited except in pursuit of someone already fleeing downward. What begins as a prestigious neighborhood becomes ordinary working-class space. Sunlight thins between the emerging towers. Office towers convert to crowded residential blocks. Plazas turn into loading zones and then into forgotten maintenance yards. Over time, facades darken under exhaust and grime, the hollows that once advertised galactic banking. Consortia now flicker half-functional, pushing obsolete brands whose parent corporations no longer exist. Above, those same products have been replaced twice over. But down here, the past keeps selling itself, in endless loops. Another century passes and the same level sinks again, this time in status rather than in altitude, as the upper city claims the wealth and the light side of public attention. The mid-levels inherit the noise and the pressure, while the levels below them inherit neglect. Rents drop. Infrastructure repairs are deferred. Entire wings are sealed after minor structural failures instead of rebuilt. The district's name changes in daily speech, first shortened, then replaced entirely, as newer hubs claim prestige in these lower bands. Entire cultural eras remain fossilized. Architectural forms that were modern during some long-forgotten conflict still frame doorways. Obsolete droids shuffle along on jury-rigged power cells, speaking dialects. No protocol unit has updated in generations. Old propaganda from past wars peels on bulkheads. Campaigns urging loyalty to chancellors whose statues on the surface have already been removed or replaced by the next administration. For thousands of years, this cycle repeats for the next 1,000 years of any given level. The pattern is nearly the same: ascent, plateau, decline, burial. Each descent deeper into Coruscant's body becomes a descent backward through its memory, passing through styles of armor, on security hollows, through changing silhouettes of starships, on advertisements, through slang frozen in graffiti that no longer reaches any living audience. In time-hold districts pass from active concern into rumor. Their official records archive, their maintenance budgets quietly absorbed elsewhere. What remains is a legend of some level number spoken in cantinas. Higher up, a place said to be dangerous, haunted, or simply gone. And somewhere below, another access hatch waits another rusted threshold into an era that once believed itself to be the very height of the galactic future. Ghost levels and sealed doors. The cartography of the forgotten. Down in those depths, the map itself becomes an unreliable narrator. Power depends on knowing the terrain. But what happens when the terrain refuses to stay fixed? The answer on Coruscant is an underworld where even the most meticulous charts leave blank spaces. And those blanks invite stories. Among the most unsettling of these blanks are the so-called ghost levels. These are flaws that exist in the numbering system, their designations printed on ancient maintenance logs and half-lit. Turbo-lift panels, yet officially they are decommissioned, collapsed, or written off as inaccessible on paper. They are gone in durasteel and permacrete. They linger, fractured, flooded, or half-crushed by later construction. The story of Coruscant's depths is not only about what was built, but about what was meant to be forgotten and never quite was. Over time, this created a strange cartography. Whole ranges of level numbers run past in the records with no active assignments. Schematics show corridors that end in white space or power conduits that feed into nothing and then continue again. Dozens of meters below, overlapping jurisdictions make the confusion worse. The Planetary Security Force, the Judicials, the Senate Zoning Office, and private megacorporations all kept their own maps when archives burned during wars or when data was quietly purged. Entire sectors slipped through the cracks. Some regions are still listed under names of corporations that no longer exist, their original architects long dead, their blueprints corrupted beyond use. In those places, the physical city tells a different truth. Sealed bulkheads span tunnels that once carried commuter traffic. Welded turbo-lift doors sit behind layers of graffiti, their control panels ripped out. Transit tubes are filled with rubble and rusted cargo crates. Yet none of these barriers are absolute smugglers. Pay slicers to probe old control grids and find forgotten override codes. Scavengers trace vibration and airflow to guess where hollow spaces remain. A single plasma cutter in the right hand can turn a condemned shaft into a secret artery between levels. What followed was an invisible second network of routes, threading through areas the official maps insist do not exist. This cartographic uncertainty becomes fertile ground for myth. Every missing floor number gathers its own legend. One story speaks of a maintenance crew sent to stabilize a sinking support cluster, only for their entire level designation to vanish from the grid days. Later, some whisper of cursed decks where the force feels thin, and sound refuses to carry others, claim that during earlier conflicts, experimental weapons or dark side projects were hidden on abandoned strata, and when something went wrong, the fastest solution was to erase the district from every accessible file. Yet the most disquieting truth is simpler. Even the most powerful senators and the wisest Jedi Masters do not know every corridor that still yawns open below their feet. For thousands of years, the surface has risen while the records have frayed, leaving pockets of darkness that can shelter both predators and refugees. And somewhere beyond the last verified schematic, another door waits, sealed in silence until the next desperate hand forces it open. The first shadows. Early slums beneath a rising republic as the last sealed hatch gives way and the forgotten passage opens. The galaxy above continues to celebrate its own progress. The Senate debates trade routes. The Jedi Temple glows against the night, and the surface believes itself to be the measure of Coruscant's greatness. But power leaves shadows, and on Coruscant, those shadows take the form of entire levels. In the early centuries of the Republic, the planet city is still climbing its way toward the clouds. Each new layer of durasteel and transparasteel rests on older decks of factories, transit hubs, and worker barracks. What followed was a gradual dimming. The once open industrial terraces that saw real sunlight for a few hours each day find themselves buried beneath newer platforms. The sky becomes a memory replaced by a stained canopy of support struts and flickering lamps as the wealthiest citizens and most prestigious ministries claim the higher plazas. Those who build the city are pushed downward. Workers, migrants, and refugees from distant galactic wars cluster in the spaces left behind, unable to afford the bright promenades above. They take over decommissioned storage bays, abandoned loading docks, and forgotten service corridors. A cargo hold becomes a tenement. A maintenance shaft becomes a narrow street tarps and welded scrap-form walls where architects never intended anyone to live. Over time, these twilight decks begin to develop their own fragile order. In the absence of official zoning residents, string cables to tap forgotten power lines, they rig glow panels to old conduits and run hoses through ventilation trunks to siphon water from main lines. Unlicensed food stalls appear, where freight speeders once queued, serving watered broth and grilled ration paste beside the hum of ancient generators. In one corner, a migrant from a flooded agri-world fries fungus in recycled oil. In another, a refugee from a border conflict sells spice. Tea brewed in a repurposed coolant tank with credits, scarce barter becomes the language of survival. Tools are traded for food, shifts of labor exchanged for a place to sleep. In these cramped markets, the first small-time gangs begin to emerge. At first, they are groups of older dockhands and street toughs offering to guard stalls and chase away scavengers in exchange for a cut of the trade. But protection easily becomes control, and in levels where the Coruscant security force rarely bothers to patrol, their word becomes law official reports in the Senate frame. These communities as temporary overflow zones are necessary inconvenience. While the great project of planetary urbanization continues, the Republic's idealistic self-image insists that prosperity will eventually trickle back down through the levels that once the last scaffolds are cleared and the last towers raised. Every citizen will share in the light side of its promise, yet decades stretch into centuries and the makeshift homes harden into neighborhoods. Children grow up who have never seen the true sky, and the story of their lives is written in artificial dusk for the next 1,000 years. As the Republic's prestige expands across the core worlds, the city beneath it deepens in both structure and society. Layer after layer of transit tunnels, utility grids, and housing decks stack atop one another until the original ground level lies buried under myth. What they found there would change everything is whispered about old ruins and natural caverns far below. But even long before those depths are reached, a parallel Coruscant has already formed a city of shadows, markets, and unrecorded loyalties. And somewhere just beyond the reach of official maps, the first true crime lords are beginning to test how far that shadowed power can grow, descending through eras, a time-lapse of the underworld, From those first crime lords testing the shadows, the underworld begins to stretch itself along the entire spine of Coruscant's history. Every era above carves a new layer below. Power shifts on the surface become sediment in the depths over time. What looks eternal from the Senate balcony is constantly eroding in the dark, in the early Republic when the Senate is still finding its voice. The lowest levels are mostly infrastructure maintenance tunnels, power conduits, and forgotten foundations. Crews abandon obsolete transit lines and sealed reservoirs. Each new project is laid on top of the old, and what followed was a slow burial of entire districts. The displaced workers and early refugees from frontier conflicts drift downward, following cheap housing and unregulated corners, until the underworld becomes their only stable ground by the High Republic age, when the light side seems ascendant and the Jedi patrol gleaming skylanes. The depths tell another story. Prosperity in the core draws migrants from 1,000 worlds. Those turned away from pristine mid-level towers sink into the strata. Beneath they bring their languages, food rituals and quiet traumas from pirate raids and border wars. Cantinas on levels few officials remember become mosaics of the galactic rim. Veterans of forgotten campaigns work as enforcers or bodyguards, their skills purchased by whoever can pay, while ancient service corridors evolve into smuggling routes in the centuries before. The Clone Wars Coruscant reaches a fever of expansion. New maglev spines, new droid-controlled traffic grids, new power nets. Each innovation renders the previous system obsolete and shoves it downward. Abandoned tram platforms turn into markets. Scavengers strip decommissioned droids for black market parts. Old power nodes flicker with unstable energy, tapped illegally to light cramped apartments. This is the era when syndicates understand that the depths are not a problem, but an opportunity suppressed on the surface. They retreat into the maze below and rebuild. During the Clone Wars themselves, the pattern intensifies. The galaxy fractures into open conflict, and the capital becomes a magnet for refugees. Whole transports of civilians from separatist sieges end up registered in neat surface records, but actually housed far below. Wounded clones discharged from service, and agents burned in shadow operations vanish into the same levels. What they found there would change everything for many of them. A new life under crime lords or information brokers who value their experience in war. The story of each small alley becomes entangled with galactic strategy under the Empire. The pressure deepens, Imperial security squeezes visible gangs while quietly using others as deniable assets. Black sun cells, crimson dawn fronts, and hut interests cycle through crackdowns and resurgences. When the spotlight grows too bright, they simply sink another few levels down into ghost decks and sealed maintenance rings for the next 1,000 years of Coruscant's recorded history. This rhythm of repression and retreat would shape the criminal map, even after the Empire falls in the New Republic era. The pattern does not end. It only changes. Veterans from both sides of the galactic civil war drift into the depths carrying scars of the dark side and the light side alike. Decommissioned Imperial tech and rebel surplus flood. Forgotten hangars, entire power grids are left half upgraded, leaving pockets of darkness where local bosses rule uncontested. Somewhere amid this long descent lies level 1313, a single slice of this layered history. And in the next sections, the focus will narrow to night and streets where all these eras still echo under flickering neon. Light fades, neon glows, crossing the threshold into the true underworld. From that promise of narrowing focus, the descent continues, and the city itself begins to change. At first, the shift is almost gentle. Skylanes grow thinner overhead, traffic breaks into scattered streams, and the constant glow of the upper towers recedes into a distant haze. Windows draw closer together, then shrink entirely until whole facades become blank, durasteel and ferrocrete. The open sky of Coruscant is no longer a sky at all, but a memory seen in reflection on grime-streaked transparasteel around these depths. The architecture tightens the gaps between levels, compressing into stacked strata. The spaces that once let in natural light are bridged over and sealed. The last hints of sun and stars are filtered into faint shafts that vanish behind gantries and freight conduits. What followed was a slow surrender of daylight to neon first, as an accent, then as a necessity, until the ceiling of the higher levels hardens into a permanent sky of durasteel, humming with buried power lines and forgotten maintenance hatches. Over time, the air itself testifies to the crossing. Above, the currents were scrubbed and cycled to near clarity. Here, the flavor of the atmosphere thickens. Recycled air carries the metallic taste of rust and coolant, mingled with drifting smoke from street vendors' grills and the sharp chemical sting of industrial solvents. The soundscape shifts as well. The distant roar of skylane traffic fades into the rattle of freight, lifts, the grind of ancient conveyor belts, and the echoing clatter of cargo crates shunted through narrow loading bays in these corridors. The clean lines of corporate towers give way to exposed piping, patched walls, and conduits wrapped in layers of insulation and tape light. Side ideals of order and transparency are replaced by a more pragmatic geometry. Every surface is repaired, reused, or quietly abandoned. Broken hollow signs flicker in countless scripts, offering cheap rooms, unlicensed medbays, or no questions. Asked transit passes. Their colors stain the walkways in shifting bands of cyan magenta and sickly yellow around certain depth ranges. The social gravity inverts. Among the most notorious are the 1300s, where level 1313 sits as a symbol of the transition. Here, the balance of power tilts away from official institutions and toward local gangs, syndicates, and community leaders. The story of Coruscant's authority becomes fractured precinct houses, and sector offices still exist, but their reach is negotiated each block, an understanding between enforcers, Black Sun lieutenants, hut brokers, and the quiet figures who run food stalls and repair shops that everyone depends on. The sensory palette of the underworld settles into a constant low-level vibration. Machinery thrums through the bones of the structure. The floor plates never entirely still. The glow of signage and jury-rigged lamps replaces any notion of a natural cycle of day and night. What they found there would change everything for those who descend. Long enough time is measured not by sunsets, but by shift changes, by the opening of night markets, and the closing of certain doors from this threshold downward. The underworld is no longer an exception to Coruscant, but its dominant reality, stretching for thousands of levels below what remains of the surface, becomes only the most recent layer in a far older accumulation of lives and structures for the next 1,000 years. In galactic history, this buried expanse would shape crime politics and quiet survival in ways the upper towers barely acknowledge. And deeper still, the foundations grow stranger, older, and darker. Level 1313. The mythic middle of the abyss. Deeper still in that maze of foundations, one number begins to gather all the whispered fears and fascinations of the underworld into a single point of focus. The number is 1313. What could make one level among thousands stand out in galactic memory? The answer is that level 1313 became the mythic middle of the abyss, a place where the descent stops, feeling theoretical, and starts to feel final. In most retellings, the story of Coruscant's depths bends toward this level. Bounty hunters speak of it as neutral ground and hunting preserve. At once, smugglers remember it as a crossroads where any cargo can vanish and any identity can be remade. Urban legends insist that if something cannot be bought on 1313, it does not exist at all over time. Its very designation turns into shorthand for the point of no return, the place where the light side of the city's promises gives way to the dark side of its realities. Yet 1313 did not begin as a den of predators in the early industrial age of Coruscant. It functioned as a heavy support stratum, an enormous belt of factories, cargo depots and maintenance hangars built to feed power materials and repair crews upward toward more prestigious districts. The humming of generators and the rumble of freight trams once defined its soundscape. Not blaster fire and muffled screams, droid assembly lines stretched for kilometers, and entire families earned modest but steady livelihoods under the glow of utilitarian strip lighting. What followed was a slow hollowing out that mirrored broader shifts in galactic economics. As automation advanced and off-world manufacturing grew cheaper, major corporations began relocating their primary facilities to distant worlds. Shipping lanes were rerouted to newer ports, closer to orbit, leaving 1313's loading bays quiet, its cranes frozen mid-swing, and its warehouses half full, then empty for the next 1,000 years in infrastructure planning. The level lingered in an uncomfortable limbo, too valuable to demolish, too outdated to modernize. In the silence that followed, organized crime listened carefully. Black Sun lieutenants, Hutt agents, and local syndicates recognized the power of a vast enclosed volume, already wired for heavy machinery and shielded from casual oversight. They converted abandoned foundries into safe houses, sealed cargo vaults into weapons caches, and forgotten maintenance tunnels into discreet arteries. For contraband, entire blocks of worker housing became gang barracks, while old inspection offices turned into counting rooms, interrogation chambers, and improvised throne halls for ambitious crime lords over time. 1313 transformed into a layered ecosystem of the illicit black market. Bazaars bloomed in former loading concourses, their stalls lit by flickering cables tapped illegally into forgotten grids. Bounty brokers set up behind reinforced transparent steel, repurposed from starship yards and cantinas, spilled neon light into narrow alleys, where deals were sealed with a quiet nod rather than a contract. Even in an empire ruled from shining towers, the real currency of fear and favor often changed hands here, far below the gaze of Jedi or Senate alike. Later in this descent, there will be a slow walk through a single night on level 1313, following one unremarkable corridor from its first distant footsteps to the moment the lights fail, and in that darkness, something older than any gang quietly stirs. The industrial veins, the works district, and power below. Yet even that quiet stirring depends on something deeper. Still, power does not only flow through credits, favors, or fear. It also moves through cables, coolant lines, and reactor cores. What happens when the lifeblood of a city is hidden in plain sight beneath its own foundations? The answer is the works district and the industrial veins that sustain Coruscant from the shadows. For most citizens, the works is a name on a utility bill, a distant cluster of smokestacks glimpsed. From a skylane, in truth, it is a sprawling maze of factories, refineries, and power plants stretching across multiple levels. Many of its facilities run on automated droid lines, their organic overseers reduced to skeleton crews, monitoring consoles while machines stamp, weld, and refine through endless shifts. Over time, some sections were modernized, others were left behind, sealed doors and obsolete equipment quietly sinking into the underworld beneath. This is where the boundary blurs between official infrastructure and shadow operations. The story of the works is not only the story of sanctioned production, but of forgotten wings repurposed in the dark abandoned assembly floors, become discreet landing bays for smugglers. Old coolant depots turn into gang armories and empty control rooms, host encrypted meetings between Syndicate lieutenants and corrupt officials. What followed was a slow hollowing out of the district's edges until legitimate pipelines ran only a few meters away from criminally strongholds that the authorities pretended not to see inside the works. The sound never truly stops. Conveyor belts clatter in the distance, droid footsteps ring against durasteel catwalks, and furnaces roar behind thick blast doors, venting steamrolls through maintenance corridors in warm rhythmic breaths, bathing everything in a faint metallic haze. In some sectors, the glow of open smelters paints forgotten walkways in deep orange light, casting moving shadows that suggest motion, even when no one is there. The constant vibration seeps into the bones of the structure, turning every railing and ladder into a quiet tuning fork for residents in the levels below. These systems are not abstract utilities, but survival itself. Illicit power siphons clamp onto forgotten conduits, sending stolen current into patched-together housing blocks. Water mains are quietly rerouted through hidden valves, feeding systems that never appear on official maps, and behind rusted durasteel panels, small access hatches lead up into the works, where technicians and scavengers slip through to service their taps or vanish entirely. One wrong cut can plunge an entire block into darkness, yet the risk is taken again and again, because the alternative is freezing in the galactic night, During times of war or occupation, the importance of these industrial veins becomes impossible to ignore control. The works and entire districts above and below can be starved or empowered. The Clone Wars turned some refineries into contested zones as droids and clones fought over what appeared to be anonymous machinery. But what they found there would change everything for commanders watching supply readouts. A single captured relay meant starships, fueled factories, restarted, and black market grids suddenly silent. In more than one conflict, a quiet order to shut down a substation has done more damage than a turbo-laser barrage. Yet the works is not the end of this descent. Further below the pipes, thin the lights fail and the neat geometry of industry begins to fray into something older. The next layers are where infrastructure gives way to ruins and the last traces of planned design are swallowed by the deep. Neon and noise, Cocoa Town, Uskru, and the entertainment underbelly. Down in that fraying geometry, the city does something unexpected. Instead of plunging straight into ruin, it flares once more into color and sound. Neon cuts through the gloom, and the darkness of the deep is held back for a moment by music and hollow signs. This is the threshold where industry gives way to entertainment, where the descent pauses for a drink before continuing downward. Here, the story of the mid-levels turns toward Cocoa Town and the Uskru district, sprawling belts of nightlife wrapped around transit hubs and maintenance shafts. Both districts sit at a liminal depth close enough to the surface that tourists and visiting officials still wander their promenades, yet only a few elevator stops above the true underworld. They are the city's twilight band, neither the bright light side of respectable Coruscant nor the fully abandoned dark side below Cocoa Town, grew around hangar complexes and refueling platforms, its name echoing an older designation for the nearby commercial concourses. Over time, those concourses filled with diners that never close, pilot bars and modest sabacc halls. Freighter crews fresh from the hyperlanes rub shoulders with dock workers and exhausted clerks from the nearby administrative towers. Even Jedi on quiet escort duty have been known to pass through in plain robes, watching the crowds from corner booths further along the curve of the planet. Uskru district offers a harsher glow, its avenues crowded with holotheaters, dance clubs, and higher-stakes casinos. The galactic spotlight touched this district when a famous opera house hosted Sith and Senator alike. During the last days of the Republic, what followed was not just a performance but whispered conversations in private boxes deals that would shape entire campaigns while the orchestra played unheard beneath. On any given night, the clientele in these zones forms a careful mosaic off-duty. Coruscant Guard officers drink beside undercover colleagues, pretending to be spice runners. Syndicate enforcers from Black Sun, the Pikes, or local gangs linger at sabacc tables, watching who wins too often. Information brokers sit alone at the bar, nursing the same glass for hours, listening as pilots brag about unregistered cargo routes and minor officials complain about classified assignments. Many of the brightest venues here are only fronts. A cheerful cantina whose back door leads to a soundproofed room where rival gangs divide territory. A bustling casino whose private lounge hosts a corrupt bureaucrat trading power grid access codes for untraceable credits. Even an innocuous droid repair shop can hide a basement where slicers tap forgotten data trunks, selling stolen schedules to bounty hunters and smugglers in the shadows. Law enforcement still reaches these levels, but only selectively. Raids are announced by the sudden silence of a whole block as shutters drop and music cuts mid-song. Yet the real arrangements happen one level down, through maintenance shafts and service corridors that connect Cocoa Town and Uskru to the older strata beneath. What they found there would change everything for those bold enough to follow the path. For many patrons, this is only a night out, a meal, a show, a few hands of sabacc. Yet every doorway here stands only a few steps from the true underworld below. And without ever realizing it, they brush against the edges of that deeper darkness before the descent continues. Transit arteries, turbo lifts, trains and secret shafts. And when that descent continues, it does not happen in a single clean drop. Instead, it moves step by step through the arteries of the planet, the invisible veins that carry bodies, credits, and secrets. Between the strata of the Ecumenopolis power on Coruscant is not only about who commands the streets, it is about who commands the ways between them. For most citizens, the story of movement is simple. They see only the official systems, high-speed maglev trains streaking through enclosed tubes between glittering spires, public turbo lifts sealed in transparent steel columns, and vast freight elevators buried in service cores. These lines bind major hubs across thousands of levels, each train a sealed capsule of light-side order, gliding from upper senatorial platforms down to mid-tier commercial canyons, then rising again without ever truly touching the dark below. Over time, planners and politicians shape these routes to favor the visible city. Many maglev lines run express between upper and mid-level districts, skipping entire bands of levels that have been written off as obsolete or unsafe on transit schematics. Whole neighborhoods simply vanish, designated as restricted zones or infrastructure layers rather than homes. This is how the underworld becomes isolated not by walls but by absence. The fast paths pass overhead in a blur of repulsor hum, while the depths wait in the stale air beneath. In those forgotten bands, movement answers to older rhythms. Decommissioned tramways still cling to their tracks, carriages patched with scavenged durasteel rattle through tunnels that once served industrial hubs. Ancient lift cages descend with a shudder through shafts whose original architects are remembered only in obscure galactic archives. Here, a single functioning freight elevator can decide whether a block thrives or starves, and what followed was an economy built on access rather than law wrapped around and between these official lines runs another network, entirely maintenance shafts. Narrow ladder wells and emergency stairwells plunge past habitable levels into darkness. Designed for droids and repair crews, they become unofficial pathways for smugglers, slicers, and fugitives, fleeing surveillance sensor blind corners and power conduit forests. Offer pockets where the Force feels strangely muffled by meters of duracrete and tangled metal. In these places, the Empire once hid listening posts, and the Sith once moved unseen beneath Jedi patrol routes. Control of such passages would shape every criminal hierarchy, from local gangs to galactic syndicates. Stairwells and lift banks become choke points where movement can be taxed, ambushed, or denied. A single blast door at the base of a shaft can trap an entire neighborhood above, while toll collectors in repurposed security armor demand credits, weapons, or favors to let anyone descend. What followed was a quiet war of doors and codes, fought not in open streets, but in the gaps between levels over time. Entire micro-societies grew up around these arteries. Lift operators who know which buttons are never pressed, tunnel guides who can thread a path through sealed maglev spurs and collapsed ghost levels, information brokers who trade in floor plans and forgotten access codes. For them, the city is not a flat map, but a vertical maze, and somewhere far below, beyond the last working indicator light, there are rumors of a shaft that was never on any plan at all, a descent so deep that even the Force feels thin, and what waits at the bottom remains unnamed. Power in the dark, Black Sun, Crimson Dawn, and the Syndicate web. Down in those unnamed depths, power does not wear senatorial robes or Jedi cloaks. It moves through shadows, through credits, favors, and fear. The question is simple: who truly rules a world city when the law cannot see its own foundations? The answer is the Syndicates. The story of Coruscant's Underworld is also the story of the galactic crime empires that anchor themselves in its forgotten levels over time. The oldest of these powers carved its mark into the durasteel Black Sun, an ancient multi-species syndicate that predates many modern governments, while surface history remembers chancellors and wars. Black Sun remembers shipping lanes and compromised officials. It thrives on smuggling, extortion, and political manipulation. Its Vigo lieutenants maintain hidden strongholds in the lower levels, behind unmarked blast doors, or buried inside derelict industrial blocks. On a level such as 1313, a repair shop's back room might open into a meeting chamber where decisions are made that would shape elections half a planet away. Black Sun prefers webs to banners. Its influence stretches through port officials, traffic controllers, and holonet technicians. It rarely needs open conflict when a forged cargo code or a missing file can achieve the same result. For thousands of years, syndicates of this kind have learned that subtle pressure applied at the right junction can move more mass than any turbo laser battery. Then came a newer name, Crimson Dawn, where Black Sun feels ancient and smoke-filled. Crimson Dawn is sleek, almost corporate. Its rise in the final days of the Republic and the age of the Empire brought a different philosophy to the same dark trade offices pose. As logistics firms' contracts are written in precise legal language and assassins arrive on schedule, Crimson Dawn sees Coruscant less as a marketplace and more as a nexus of information and influence. A single compromised aide in the Senate district can be worth more than an entire spice shipment pattern breaks. Appear in the depths, a pristine speeder parked in a rusted hangar, a bodyguard unit in matching armor moving through a crowd of patched jackets. These are the fingerprints of Crimson Dawn. What followed was a quiet war of bribes, blackmail, and disappearances that never reached the holofeeds. Beyond them, the Hutt cartels and the Pike Syndicate project. Their power inward, rather than occupy territory. Outright massive Hutt Kajidics on distant worlds use local lieutenants on Coruscant to manage spice routes and debt networks. Pike agents oversee distribution nodes hidden near abandoned transit spurs. Spice is moved through forgotten maglev tunnels into cramped apartments where families balance survival against addiction and obligation. The Hutts seldom descend in person. They do not need to. A single contract enforced by a bounty hunter can speak more clearly than any speech in the Senate. These empires overlap. Their territories bleed together. An alley might be taxed by Black Sun, guarded by a Hutt enforcer, and supplied with spice by the Pikes. Uneasy truces hold until a shipment vanishes or a lieutenant overreaches. Then doors are welded shut, markets burn, and for a few hours the distant thunder of blaster fire echoes up forgotten shafts. Most surface citizens never hear it. For many who live below the mid-levels, these syndicates function as de facto governments. Protection rackets become the only police work in smuggling crews, replace formal employment, and justice arrives as a blaster at dawn, rather than a court summons in the absence of the Republic or the Empire. The dark side of order is enforced by whoever can pay the most mercenaries. Yet even here, there are rules, codes of conduct enforced by fear and necessity, and deeper still beneath the reach of any syndicate. Other powers wait in the dark, local lords of the levels, gangs, crews, and micro-emperors, deeper still beneath the reach of any syndicate. Other powers wait in the dark, but power on Coruscant is never abstract for long. It wears colors, it sprays symbols, it walks in crews through specific corridors and stairwells. Each level, each sector becomes a patchwork of small empires run by whoever can hold a block for more than a standard year. The story of the underworld at street level is the story of these micro-emperors and the fragile peace they enforce with graffiti and blaster fire on a mid-depth such as level 1313. The walls themselves become a map. One alley might be drowned in the yellow sigil of the glowsticks, a crew that controls stolen power couplings and illegal lighting rigs. Another corridor might carry the jagged red spiral of the razor dogs, whose territory includes the freight lift, shafts, and the markets that cluster around them. What followed was an endless negotiation of borders, doors painted in gang colors, promise protection to those who pay, and swift punishment to those who do not. Inside each crew, the hierarchy mirrors the greater syndicates, but on a more intimate scale. At the top stands a boss or lord, sometimes a grizzled enforcer, sometimes a quiet slicer who never leaves the back room beneath them. Lieutenants manage specific stairwells or turbo lift nodes, while enforcers collect credits and break the rare stubborn jaw slicers, maintain access to blacked-out cameras and forgotten security grids, and young lookouts lean on railings, watching for strangers. Many of them grew up together, shared the same ration lines, and learned early that in the absence of Republic courts, loyalty is the only law. These local lords sell more than fear. They sell predictability for residents trapped between levels. A gang might guarantee that lights stay on, that water flows from cracked pipes, that disputes over stolen rations are settled without triggering a full-scale corridor war. In return, they demand regular fees, a percentage of every store's income, and sometimes a son or daughter pressed into service. Refusal brings smashed doors. Vanished relatives and bodies drop down maintenance shafts as quiet warnings to the rest over time. The gravitational pull of larger syndicates reaches even these forgotten stairwells. A strong crew on one level might find Black Sun offering weapons and off-world passage in exchange for tribute. Others feel the shadow of the Hutt Khajidics or Crimson Dawn, demanding they serve as local eyes and ears. Some accept and become branded subsidiaries. Others resist and are methodically erased. A few attempt a dangerous balance, taking credits from one syndicate while quietly selling information to its rival. That balance rarely lasts for the next 1,000 years of Coruscant's history. Such choices would shape which alleys remained habitable and which became killing grounds. Yet not all power in the depths carries a blaster. There are fixers who arrange forged ident chips and quiet transfers between levels, medics who patch wounds in hidden clinics and keep careful lists of debts and favors, and information brokers who sit in dim corner booths, trading rumors about Jedi sightings or Imperial patrol routes. These figures seldom mark walls with symbols. They let others fight over paint and territory. With a single introduction denied or a single rumor whispered, they can decide who rises, who starves, and who simply disappears into a forgotten shaft below. A night on 1313, cantinas, contracts, and narrow escapes down on 1313. Those quiet brokers are only the first threshold beyond them. The underworld opens in full. The descent begins with an old turbo lift hidden behind a rusted service door. Its cage shudders as it drops past level markers that have not been updated in decades. The hum of modern traffic fades, replaced by the rattle of loose panels and the distant thrum of overloaded power conduits. The air grows heavier, the light dimmer, until at last the lift brakes screech and the doors grind aside. What follows was always the same ritual of arrival. The doors part onto a crowded concourse, washed in neon and holographic glow. Cramped stalls press against the walls, selling skewered street food. Black market power cells and unregistered datapads overhead. A tangle of pipes, sweats, condensation that falls in slow, irregular drops onto the passing crowd. Voices overlap in a dozen galactic languages. Music from different cantinas bleeds together into a steady pulse of percussion and bass. The force here feels dense, tangled with fear, anticipation, and the quiet calculations of survival. Near the center of this maze stands a cantina that functions as a microcosm of the entire level. Its doorway is framed by flickering signage, promising cold drinks, and no questions asked inside haze from spice smoke and coolant vapor hangs. Beneath low ceilings, a Twi'lek singer stands beneath a cracked spotlight, her voice threading through an old standard about lost worlds and forgotten wars at the bar. A droid bartender with mismatched photoreceptors tracks dozens of conversations at once, adjusting volume filters and music levels with mechanical precision. In the shadowed corners sit bounty hunters and smugglers in worn armor plates and stained flight jackets. The story of the night unfolds at one such table where a bounty contract is being shaped. An employer in understated robes slides a holochip across the surface, its blue light reflecting off scarred metal. The hunter studies the projection. A face, a name, a level range, and a payout that would shape the next few months of work questions. Follow in low tones is the target armed connected, protected by any local gang. The answers come with careful pauses, each word weighed for risk and advantage. Credits shift in quiet increments. Threats remain mostly unspoken yet present in the way hands rest near blasters beneath the table. Over time, the negotiation drifts toward the alleys beyond the cantina. The hunter rises, exits through a side door, and steps into a narrower passage where the neon thins and the soundscape changes. Flickering signs cast sickly colors across damp, duracrete walls. Pipes run overhead, dripping rust-tinted water into shallow gutters. Further on, a maintenance corridor peels away almost silent, except for the distant rumble of heavy machinery. Here, a deal can be concluded without witnesses, or it can dissolve in an instant. A target might vanish through a forgotten hatch. A hidden sniper might end the contract before it truly begins the dark side. Here is not a grand Sith ritual, but a constant pressure toward betrayal. Eventually, the path bends back toward the main concourse. The noise returns in stages. First, a faint rhythm then scattered laughter, then the full roar of 1313's restless routine. Vendors argue over prices. Children chase a repurposed training remote through the crowd. A tired worker in stained overalls leans against a railing, eating a simple meal. This is the other truth of the level beneath the contracts, and the quiet violence life persists in its own fragile rhythm. Yet somewhere deeper below, another lift descends toward levels that most on 1-3 only mention in whispers, living in the shadows. Homes, families, and makeshift neighborhoods. Deeper below those whispered levels, the architecture itself begins to change. The clean lines and ordered grids of mid-city design give way to a patchwork of eras. Corridors bend where old support pylons have sagged. Ceilings dip low where newer construction has been laid directly atop forgotten transit lines. In these pockets of half-remembered infrastructure, entire communities have learned to live in the shadows, in vast industrial chambers, once meant for starship assembly or droid fabrication. Temporary partitions now divide the space into dozens of narrow dwellings. What followed was not careful urban planning, but survival. Thin walls of plasteel and scavenged durasteel mark out rooms where families sleep in triple-stacked bunks. Above them, prefab hab cubes are piled 3 and 4 high, clinging to gantries and catwalks with maglocks and improvised braces, while in sealed cargo bays, shanties bloom from scrap plating and discarded container shells, each one wired into a maze of illegal power taps that flicker whenever a distant factory shifts into a higher gear for those who call these levels home. The story of daily life is measured not in grand battles between Sith and Jedi, but in small acts of adaptation. Fabric hangings stretch from ceiling to floor, turning a single metal box into a cluster of private corners. An old protocol droid torso becomes a storage chest, its empty eye sockets filled with tools and keepsakes. Repulsor lift. Housings are flipped and padded to serve as chairs. Rusted walls disappear beneath layers of hand-painted murals. Starfields imagined by residents who have never seen the open sky portraits of ancestors who once worked nearer the light side of the city above. Over time, a quiet rhythm settles across these neighborhoods. Shift sirens from nearby refineries mark the change of day and night more reliably than any chronometer. Workers in oil-stained coveralls file through pressure doors toward factories, repair shops, and recycling centers. Children thread through crowded corridors, stepping over coolant hoses and power conduits on their way to improvised schools held in decommissioned loading bays. Elders gather near heat exchangers, recounting tales of higher levels they knew in their youth, stories of sunlit plazas, Jedi patrols, and air traffic that flowed in ordered lanes instead of the chaotic tangle of pipes and shadows that surrounds them now. Despite the ever-present threat of gang conflict and corporate neglect, these communities do not survive alone. Shared food kitchens operate from old mess halls, serving nutrient stews stretched with whatever can be bartered from black market vendors. Informal clinics, staffed by retired medics and droid techs, patch up injuries from factory accidents and stray blaster fire. Neighborhood watches coordinate through flickering comm panels, warning residents when a protection crew or enforcer squad is on the move. In these small networks, there is a different expression of power, not the dominance of an empire, but the simple determination to endure from a distance. It might seem temporary, a way station for those waiting to climb back toward the surface. Yet for many families, this is permanent ground for thousands of years. Levels have risen and fallen above them, but their own histories are etched into these corridors. Birth markings on bulkheads, growth tallies carved into door frames, memorial candles arranged beneath ventilation grates. What they found there would change everything for their descendants. A sense of belonging not to the shining skyline but to the underworld itself. And as the city descends still further into darkness, other communities wait even closer to the forgotten bedrock of Coruscant. Food, water and air, survival, logistics in the depths. As those communities press closer to the forgotten bedrock, another question quietly takes shape. How does a city survive when the sun never reaches its streets? The answer lies in the machinery, humming behind every wall, and in the quiet bargains struck to keep that machinery running from the shining Senate district down to the industrial depths. Coruscant's utility grids were designed to reach almost every registered level. Power conduits plunge in, bundled arteries, water mains descend through reinforced shafts, and air recyclers hang on skeletal frames that vanish into darkness. But over time, those systems fracture. The lowest levels receive power in flickers water, in discolored spurts, and air that tastes of rust and engine coolant outages roll through entire sectors without warning, plunging corridors into blackness while alarms remain long since broken. In that uncertainty, the story of survival becomes intimate and improvised when an official power line fails. Residents do not wait for a distant maintenance crew. They splice into forgotten feeder cables left from an earlier construction age. Junction boxes hang open in stairwells, wrapped in mismatched insulation where a single overworked transformer might feed 3 or 4 illegal branches. Shared generators rumble in back rooms of cantinas and boarding houses, their exhaust funneled into old ventilation shafts. The sound becomes a constant low thunder, a reminder that every hour of light is borrowed water and air follow the same precarious logic. Filtration towers up above, strain pollutants from the atmosphere. But by the time recycled air drifts down to the underworld, it has passed through so many fans and ducts that its purity is mostly theoretical. Residents bolt homemade filters over vents, old droid casings stuffed with woven fiber and scavenged chemical scrubbers. Rooftop gardens on the surface become ceiling-top hydroponics. Here, trays of algae, nutrient moss, and hardy vegetables hang from support beams beneath flickering lamps, each one feeding on captured condensation and the faint warmth of nearby power conduits. Food itself becomes an economy of necessity and opportunity. Narrow walkways open onto pockets of heat and smell, where vendors tend skewers over repurposed engine coils or ladle-thick soups from battered Durasteel pots. Ration packs, diverted from military depots or disaster relief programs, arrive through black market channels, traded in bulk, and then resold in single portions to those who cannot afford a crate. Entire microcultures form around deep-level ingredients, fungi that thrive in damp maintenance tunnels, bioluminescent molds scraped from forgotten systems, and even vermin herded through makeshift pens. These become niche delicacies in the absence of anything better behind this. Fragile stability stand the fixers and quiet technicians who understand the underworld's veins better than any official survey. Once perhaps they were licensed engineers or droid specialists. Now they move through access hatches and crawl spaces, guided by memory rather than maps for a handful of credits or a promised favor. They can coax an ancient purifier back to life, reroute power from an abandoned factory floor, or tie a new settlement into a decades-old water main. What followed was a culture in which technical skill would shape not only comfort, but authority. Entire corridors owe their breathable air to one person's expertise, and that dependence can harden into loyalty or fear. In the deepest levels, survival becomes a constant negotiation with machinery. Scarcity and one another, every breath, every cup of water, every bowl of steaming street food depends on someone's decision to share or to exploit. In that slow grind of need and compromise, the underworld learns a lesson the Jedi and Sith often debate in abstract terms. The Force may bind the galaxy together, but down here, it is the fragile infrastructure of a forgotten empire and the choices of those who still tend it that decide who endures and who fades into the dark. Markets in the gloom, stalls, bazaars, and black exchanges. Down here, even commerce feels ancient, as if trade itself were another forgotten machine, still grinding in the dark. Power in the underworld is not only measured in blasters or spice, but in who controls the flow of credits and information through these shadowed corridors. The story of Coruscant's market is the story of how survival, greed, and quiet hope all share the same cramped aisles. On a typical lower level, the bazaar does not announce itself with grand entrances or clean avenues. It simply thickens around a junction where old transit lines meet until the tunnel walls disappear behind mismatched stalls hammered together from scrapped Durasteel and repurposed cargo crates. Narrow aisles twist between them, barely wide enough for two beings to pass without brushing coats. Overhead, strings of hanging lights sway in the recycled air currents, some flickering, some tinted in sickly colors that turn faces into masks. The constant murmur of haggling in dozens of languages blends with the hiss of steam vents and the distant thrum of generators, creating a low, steady hum that feels almost ritual. On one table, salvaged droid parts are piled in precarious towers, servo motors and photoreceptors still faintly ticking with residual charge. Next to them, knockoff datapads display unstable hollow interfaces, loaded with cracked software and maps of ghost levels that may or may not exist. A spice vendor measures glittering powder and compressed sticks with the same calm precision used for legal stimulants, while a nearby stall offers counterfeit ident chips that can overwrite a life in a single transaction. Under tarps and behind coded shutters, unregistered weapons change hands. Holdout blasters with their serials melted away. Vibroblades balanced for quiet work. Even military-grade rifles smuggled from distant fronts of galactic war. Yet scattered among these are rarer things smuggled from off-world. A crate of ration bars stolen from a Republic depot. A small cache of Kyber-adjacent crystals that never reached a Jedi vault. A weathered holocron casing with its core long removed. Over time, these markets have become more than places to buy and sell. They function as social hubs, the beating heart of levels that official maps pretend do not exist. News spreads here faster than through any sanctioned channel. A bartender repeats a rumor about a senator's scandal. A courier offers quiet work carrying data up toward the light side of the city. A mechanic hears about a shift in Syndicate territory before any formal announcement. What followed was an invisible struggle layered over the visible trade. Syndicate spotters lean against stall frames, apparently bored, tracking faces, hand gestures, and who lingers too long near forbidden merchandise. Undercover law enforcement drifts through the crowd in factory overalls or pilgrim robes, listening for certain names, watching for certain crates. Each side studies the other, both hunting for opportunity and threat, knowing that one careless deal here could ignite conflict that ripples through entire districts. The sensory richness of these spaces would shape memory, even for those who only pass through once. There is the sharp smell of cooking oil from skewers turning over open griddles, mingled with ozone from exposed power couplings and the metallic tang of coolant leaking from old machinery. Hollow signs cast shifting blues and reds across faces, advertising services that may or may not exist, while worn credit chips pass from hand to hand, edges smoothed by thousands of desperate trades. In this glow and murmur, it becomes easy to imagine drifting slowly along the aisles, tracing the contours of a forgotten empire in every improvised stall and wondering what deeper, more secret markets wait in the levels still below, where even the syndicates tread carefully and the dark grows truly ancient. Law above, order below, Coruscant Guard, ISB, and local justice. Yet even in those secret markets, another presence hangs in the air, unseen but never entirely absent: the law. Not the abstract law of Republic charters and Senate decrees, but the very real threat of armored boots and red-marked visors descending from above. On Coruscant, power wears many faces, and the most visible of them is the Coruscant Guard. Formally, the story of order on the galactic capital begins with elite forces tasked with protecting institutions, not allies. The Coruscant Guard, clad in stark armor and crimson markings, patrols the Senate district, the Jedi temple approaches, and the governmental spires that define the upper skyline. Their mandate is stability, the preservation of the Republic's image, and the defense of those whose decisions would shape entire sectors. Deep-level patrols exist mostly on datapads and in budget proposals. In reality, most of the Guard never sees level 1313. From time to time, however, the underworld is reminded that the surface remembers it. A Syndicate war spills too close to a turbolift hub, a Jedi investigation uncovers a weapons cache, or the ISB decides that a public demonstration of control is required. What follows was always the same pattern. Armored transports descending through the haze, searchlights cutting through the perpetual dusk, loudhailers ordering entire blocks to the floor. For days, life fractures. Checkpoints sprout at transit nodes. Doors are kicked in, and crowds are funneled past scanners while droids record every face. These high-profile raids seize contraband, arrest dozens, sometimes hundreds, and briefly silence blaster fire. Yet in the deeper levels, residents learn a quiet lesson. The guard leaves. The ESB task force is reassigned. The holofeeds declare the operation a success, and the same enforcers, brokers, and lieutenants who ducked into maintenance shafts during the sweep emerge again to collect their due. Over time, the conclusion becomes inescapable. Official law is a storm, not a climate. In the long stretches between those storms, other systems of order take hold. Gangs mark out streets where their protection is the only shield against worse predators. Syndicates impose curfews, tax stalls, and adjudicate disputes over stolen cargo or unpaid spice shipments. In some blocks, community councils of merchants and tenants meet in shuttered cantinas, agreeing on quiet hours, shared generators, and who will be quietly escorted to the nearest airlock if they threaten that fragile peace. Informal justice fills every gap. Respected elders, who remember when a now-buried transit line still ran on schedule, mediate family feuds and inheritance quarrels. In shadowed back rooms, crime lords preside over underground courts, their word enforced by silent guards rather than written codes. A debt unpaid might be worked off in labor, in information, or in scars. And above it all hangs the unspoken law of vigilante reprisal. Harm a child, betray a neighbor, sabotage a generator, and the next descent into the maintenance shafts may end with no return. For many who live their entire lives beneath the sunless canyons, justice becomes something intensely local. Not the distant statutes debated in the Senate, nor the doctrines argued by Jedi about the light side and the dark side, but the daily question of whether the nearest boss, elder, or patrol will act fairly or cruelly. In that narrow space between fear and protection, entire communities learn to navigate a world where the Empire's codes are distant noise, and the only law that truly matters is the one enforced at the end of the nearest corridor, by those whose faces are known. War echoes in the depths. Clone wars and occupations. Below down there, the law becomes whoever can afford to enforce it. But even the most feared gang enforcer answers to forces far beyond a single corridor. The underworld of Coruscant does not exist. Apart from galactic conflict, it absorbs its power, and suffering trickle downward level by level, until even the most remote war leaves echoes in the dark. Around the era of the Clone Wars, the surface of Coruscant appears to carry the burden of the conflict, gleaming military platforms, crowded space lanes, and a Senate locked in emergency sessions. Yet the story of that war stretches far below the sky lanes as worlds burn on the rim. Transports arrive heavy with silent passengers, refugees, veterans, and displaced workers who cannot afford the safer districts over time. Those who fall through the cracks follow the gravity of poverty downward into cheaper, forgotten levels. Whole families from shattered outer rim colonies end up crammed into repurposed storage blocks on levels that never appear in Senate briefings. A former dockyard on one level becomes a maze of cots and curtains. A decommissioned maintenance tunnel on another turns into a line of improvised stalls selling whatever survived the journey. What followed was an invisible redrawing of the underworld's map, as accents, cuisines, and traumas from 100 battlefields fuse into new neighborhoods beneath the city's ancient foundations, above the mid-levels. The response to war is control curfews sweep through entertainment districts, checkpoints bloom around transit hubs, surveillance holocams watch every plaza. The promise is security, but the consequence is pressure. Anyone flagged as a dissident deserter or suspected sympathizer with the separatists soon discovers that the light side of official protection has a dark side shadow. They slip downward past inattentive patrols, trading clean identity records for anonymity in the crowd, until a clone deserter can share a table with a separatist slicer and know. One asks questions beyond the next job. In this atmosphere, the black markets of the depths experience a quiet, golden age. Military surplus flows through back channels, crates of ration bars, clone armor plates, and power packs appear in dim bazaars next to rusted droids and salvaged air scrubbers. Stolen blaster rifles, once meant for the front lines, end up in the hands of local gangs. Restricted Bacta patches and combat stims circulate through cramped clinics run by unlicensed medics. Syndicates, such as Black Sun and Hut Brokers, thrive selling access to these supplies, turning distant war budgets into street-level power behind the neon and steam. The underworld becomes a shadow battlefield. Republic intelligence handlers meet nervous informants in forgotten transit stations. Separatist agents hide signal relays in obsolete maintenance droids. Sabotage teams vanish into industrial strata after striking at critical infrastructure. When the Republic falls and the Empire rises, the uniforms change. But the methods remain. Imperial Security Bureau operatives recruit the same smugglers, slicers, and street kids to watch each other, ensuring that every whisper of rebellion is heard twice, once by the insurgent and once by the state. Yet even this suffocating attention has limits. The deeper levels become a pressure valve for dissent, a place where anti-imperial songs are murmured under the noise of generators, where veterans of the Clone Wars compare scars and stories and begin to question how the Republic became an empire over time. Those questions harden into intent. Small cells test the edges of imperial reach, hiding weapons among ordinary contraband. What they found there would change everything. The realization that beneath layers of fear, routine, and traffic, the foundations of rebellion can grow in the dark without ever disturbing the skyline above. Imperial nightfall, crackdowns, propaganda, and quiet resistance. Over time, the questions whispered in backrooms begin to meet a colder answer from above. The Republic has become an empire, and the response to doubt is no longer debate, but discipline. The shining levels near the Senate and the old Jedi Temple, Titan First Stormtrooper patrols, march in precise formations across plazas. Scanners sweep crowds and holocams bloom on every corner. The skyline glows with new banners and giant projectors, loop speeches about order, stability, and the glory of the Emperor. Yet the light of that control does not reach far. The deeper the descent, the thinner the Imperial presence becomes. On the mid-levels, checkpoints appear at transit hubs and customs stations, but whole blocks beyond them are left to fend for themselves by the time the turbolifts rattle past the numbered plates of the lower sectors. The white armor has thinned to occasional raids and punitive sweeps. Entire stretches of the Works District and the industrial depths see stormtroopers only when someone has angered the wrong officer or interrupted the wrong shipment. What followed was a quiet bargain, enforced not by treaty, but by indifferent syndicates on levels such as 1313. Black Sun cells, Hut Brokers, and local gangs discover that the Empire cares less about crime than about challenge. As long as traffic flows upward, taxes and bribes reach the surface, and no one publicly defies imperial power, the underworld is allowed to run its own dark economy. When useful, these groups become unofficial tools. A Black Sun Vigo passes along rumors from a cantina. A Hut handler provides muscle for a deniable operation, and the Empire looks the other way. While spice and weapons change hands beneath that uneasy truce, lies open exploitation. The Empire sees the depths as a reservoir of bodies and secrets. Dangerous construction projects demand workers who will not be missed, so recruiters and press gangs sweep through forgotten corridors, promising credits or threatening families. Those who vanish may end up on remote shipyards, secret weapons platforms, or unmarked prison labs. In abandoned sections of Coruscant itself, lower-level residents are taken as disposable test subjects for new crowd-control toxins, interrogation serums, and surveillance implants. Others are turned into informants paid in ration chits to report any mention of Jedi rebels or treason, whispered over cheap drinks. And yet, in the same shadows, another pattern emerges, small and careful. At first, the story of resistance on Coruscant does not begin with grand speeches, but with a slicer on a ghost level rerouting an Imperial data feed to erase an arrest record. A smuggler running an ordinary cargo route adds one sealed compartment for a rebel courier. Safe houses appear as cramped apartments or shuttered workshops, their doors marked only by a certain flicker in a jury-rigged power line. What they found there would change everything for the fugitives who pass through a bed, a medkit, and a promise that the Empire does not see everything over time. These threads begin to weave together slicer cells. Coordinate to crash surveillance grids, for a single crucial hour. Smugglers map forgotten transit tunnels and maintenance shafts, creating invisible arteries through the planet-wide city on the surface. The Death Star, the Rebel fleet, and the duel between dark side and light side dominate galactic attention. But far below the battles, no one broadcasts another war is being prepared in whispers and code keys. The networks growing in the underworld of Coruscant would shape the Empire's fate long before the Emperor senses the danger, and when he finally does, the reaction will plunge the depths into a new kind of night. After the Empire, New Republic promises, old problems. When the second Death Star burns above Endor and the Emperor falls, the galaxy imagines a clean break between dark and light side, between Empire and New Republic. But what happens to a city that has already buried its past under thousands of levels? The answer lies in Coruscant's underworld, where regime change feels distant and slow in the first years after the victory at Endor. The New Republic faces a shattered galactic economy, ruined shipyards, and scattered Imperial warlords. Its leaders focus on demilitarization, on pulling back fleets and dismantling the vast war machine that drained whole sectors of resources. In theory, this is an act of mercy toward worlds brutalized by the Empire. In practice, it leaves places the Senate cannot see, very far down the list, and the depths of Coruscant slip quietly below the priority queue. What followed was a strangely quiet kind of chaos when Imperial prefects, stormtrooper garrisons, and Compnor informants are purged from the surface. The removal does not stop. At the Skylanes, many underworld crews have survived for years by aligning with local moffs or feeding information upward. Those connections vanish overnight. Power vacuums open in the Works District in the alleys of Level 1, 313, in forgotten transit nodes, where Black Sun bagmen once met. ISB handlers suddenly. Territory maps mean nothing, and every rusted bulkhead becomes a potential front line. Over time, syndicates move to fill the gaps. Black Sun lieutenants challenge, Hutt enforcers, Crimson Dawn remnants test the resolve of neighborhood gangs that once paid Imperial protection credits. Turf wars burn through stacked hab blocks while the holofeeds above celebrate peace. A cantina on one level becomes a neutral meeting ground one week and a cratered crime scene the next. This is the story of a city rearranging itself without waiting for decrees from the new Senate. The New Republic does try to reach downward amnesty programs, offer reduced sentences for slicers and smugglers willing to register and work for reconstruction teams. Infrastructure grants are earmarked to patch aging power conduits in the mid-levels community policing units, trained in alliance-style insurgency support, attempt to walk beats in districts that have not trusted uniforms since before the Clone War. But those efforts collide with entrenched realities. Illegal power taps keep whole blocks running. Black markets feed families who have never seen an official ration chip, and some former rebels, now turned officers, underestimate how deeply the old networks are woven into daily survival. Beneath all of this, the same structural wounds remain: overcrowded towers built atop sealed foundations, ghost levels formed from collapsed construction, and transit tunnels that never made it to the surface. Even with the Empire gone, the economic gravity of the planet city still pulls wealth upward and pushes risk downward. No single election can reverse centuries of planning that treated the depths as a dumping ground for noise waste and unwanted people. Over time, a pattern becomes clear. The surface changes. Flags, the hollow statues in the plazas, shift from emperors to senators, but far below, life bends rather than breaks. Syndicates merge, rename themselves, and adapt. Old smuggling routes become conduits for reconstruction supplies then. Smuggling routes again. Geography, habit, and quiet negotiation would shape the next era, far more than any speech in the new Senate chamber. And for the next 1,000 years, if Coruscant endures, the underworld will continue to move at its own pace, answering not to governments but to gravity distance and need hidden histories, pre-Republic ruins, and natural caverns over time. The mapped levels of Coruscant begin to thin out. The neat numbers on municipal charts give way to blank spaces, annotations that simply read "sealed unstable" or "depth unknown" beneath the lowest habitable districts. The city's constant machinery finally grows quiet, and another realm begins, a realm that remembers the planet before towers, before skylanes, before the first Senate decree. Far below the underworld's crowded walkways, ancient stone still breathes through the durasteel skin of the city. Natural caverns run through the bedrock, their ceilings heavy with mineral teeth that have never seen artificial light. Underground rivers once cut through these chambers cold and slow, before engineers diverted them into reservoirs and sewage flows. Remnants of those waterways remain in forgotten cisterns and echoing culverts where stagnant pools mirror faint maintenance lights. In these depths, the story of Coruscant becomes older than the Republic, older than the Jedi, and the Sith long before the first hyperspace routes reached this world. Small settlements clung to these caves. Early inhabitants built shrines into the rock, carving symbols whose meanings are now lost when the planet city began to rise. These places were not always destroyed. Instead, foundations were poured over them. Support pylons sunk straight through their sanctuaries, leaving fragments of stairways, doorframes, and idols sealed in perfect darkness. What followed was a slow burial by architecture. Every new era added weight above and pressure below, until those first temples and meeting halls became fossils in the urban strata. Some chambers still hold pottery tools and crude star maps etched into stone, their constellations no longer matching the modern sky. In a few rare sites, pre-Republic columns of black stone stand half swallowed by ferrocrete evidence that the builders of the galactic capital once walked through torchlit halls deep underground. Reaching these places is not a matter of taking a turbo lift to a lower level. Only a handful of beings ever attempt it. Licensed archaeologists with special permits descend through service shafts and collapsed transit tunnels, guided by old construction schematics. Daring scavengers follow them without permission, chasing rumors of lost technology and forgotten vaults. Sometimes a lone Force-sensitive seeker feels a pull in meditation and traces it downward through forgotten access hatches and spiral maintenance ladders. Their routes pass through crushed platforms and twisted magrail lines past pressure doors fused shut since ancient reactor accidents. In some pockets, gravity feels wrong, as if the city's own mass has bent the tunnels out of true sensors. Record unexplained energy readings, flickers of power where no grid should reach. There are stories of automated security fields snapping to life around doors that have not opened for thousands of years, and of guardian droids still marching across dust that holds no recent footprints. Life has adapted here in ways the surface never sees. Blind insects swarm around leaking coolant vents. Pale vine things grow from cracks feeding on trace radiation and chemical runoff. Larger shapes move at the edge of scanner-range creatures that hunt by vibration and heat alone in the total dark. For them, Coruscant has always been a world of tunnels and stone. The skyscrapers above mean nothing. In the end, the true age of this underworld cannot be measured in level numbers or in centuries of Republic lore. It stretches back through the deep time of rock and water and forward through every forgotten civilization, layered on top each era. Leaves a thin residue of power and memory, and the Force carries all of it. So when the next traveler descends, chasing profit, faith, or knowledge, what they find there would change everything, even if the surface never learns that the planet's oldest secrets are still awake beneath their feet. Creatures of the depths, vermin, predators, and urban ecosystems. As those oldest secrets stir beneath the foundations, another truth emerges. The underworld of Coruscant is not only a graveyard of empires and forgotten wars, it is also a living habitat, an ecosystem layered as densely as the city itself. The story of the depths is written not just in durasteel and duracrete, but in furshell and chitin. Over time, the lowest levels filled with the quiet movement of small things in the stale air of maintenance ducts. Scuttling insects trace invisible highways, following the scent of spilled stimcaf and engine coolant. Scavenger rodents with pale eyes and patchy fur slip through cracks in bulkheads. Gnawing on nutrient bricks and discarded ration packs, small reptilian feeders cling to pipework, their scales dulled by soot, snapping up larvae and anything softer than the metal around them. Entire colonies thrive on what the higher levels throw away. transforming refuse into a muted, constant rustle. Beneath the hum of generators around ancient trash chutes and collapsed service corridors, these vermin dominate, but the balance never remains simple. For long where there is prey, there are larger predators in the drowned arteries of the city. Vast cisterns and storm sewers shelter eye-stalked shapes reminiscent of Dianoga, coiled in the dark water, patiently waiting for a misstep, a dropped tool, or a careless worker leaning too far over a rail. What followed was an unspoken agreement among residents. Certain grates are never approached alone. Certain tunnels are crossed quickly and in silence high above the walkway level. Another danger circles the flickering lamps in cavernous transit halls winged. Scavengers nest in broken signage and forgotten ventilation shafts. Their silhouettes cut across failing holoads as they glide down to snatch rodents from ledges and strip meat from unclaimed bodies. Their cries echo through the metal canyons, and when their nests grow crowded, they spill into neighboring sectors, turning entire blocks into zones of quiet fear. After dusk around leaks and ruptured heat vents, the city's lifeless surfaces change constant condensation, drips from fractured coolant lines, pooling into shallow basins where thin films of algae shimmer in sickly greens and blues. Fungi bloom on insulation foam and exposed girders. Pale shelves of growth climbing toward the warmth mold creeps across old propaganda posters, blurring faces and slogans. Hardy plants with waxy leaves root in the sediment of long-abandoned plazas, their roots winding through cracked permacrete in these pockets of color. Insects swarm, rodents feed, and predators lurk at the edges waiting for something to wander too far from the light. The residents of the underworld adapt as steadily as any empire in galactic history. Some train lean alley beasts or semi-domesticated reptilian hunters to clear nests of vermin in exchange for scraps. Others learn the rhythm of the predators, avoiding specific access shafts during feeding hours and sealing doors when the winged scavengers begin to circle. Parents pass down cautionary tales to their children about unlit stairwells and silent pools, warning that the dark itself can move when watched too carelessly. Over time, this web of creatures would shape daily life in ways outsiders rarely understand. The underworld becomes not just a human or alien domain, but a complex, layered environment where countless forms of life have learned to survive in the shadows. And as the sentient inhabitants plot their own struggles for power in the next sector of this descent, another presence is already watching from the dark, waiting for the moment when those struggles spill into its territory. Faith in the shadows, cults, shrines, and quiet beliefs. Down here, that watching presence is not always a predator or a droid eye in the ceiling. Sometimes it is an icon on a shelf. A flicker of candlelight against durasteel faith survives in the underworld, even when everything else has been stripped away in cramped apartments carved out of forgotten transit shafts. Small household shrines glow against the dark. A scavenged glow rod or melted wax candle illuminates a handful of objects. A tiny idol from a distant moon, a charred family relic rescued from a war zone, a fading hollow of mountains or oceans that no longer exist on the surface of their homeworld over time. These modest corners of devotion become anchors in lives defined by motion and noise. The story of the underworld is not only one of gang syndicates and Sith legends, it is also one of quiet rituals that shift. Change a parent touching a worn talisman before stepping into the crowd, a child whispering to a hollow of ancestors before the lights cut out again on a failing power grid where the sky is only rusted pipe and duracrete. These small acts of memory would shape how whole families endure. Mainstream galactic religions reach this deep as well, but they rarely remain unchanged traditions that, on the surface, speak of transcendence. And distant stars are retold here as lessons in survival sermons about the Force, and the balance between dark side and light side become stories about not losing compassion in a place built on exploitation. Pilgrim chants that once celebrated triumph now emphasize endurance and mutual aid in some corners of level 1313. A simple gathering might recite ancient Jedi aphorisms, not to summon power, but to remind each other that restraint can prevent the next pointless conflict. Yet, in the same shadows, what followed was something far less gentle. The pressure of isolation. Poverty and fear gives rise to more secretive groups. Force, worshipping cults whisper about unseen. Currents in the depths, claiming that the underworld itself is a living conduit. A few venerate long-dead Sith as nameless patrons of strength, imagining that their spirits still drift through abandoned reactors in sealed maintenance platforms. Doomsday prophets preach beside silent maglev tracks, warning that the entire galactic city will one day collapse into the bedrock and that only their followers will be guided through the ruin. Others turn from stars entirely and deify the machinery that surrounds them. Obscure deities are said to inhabit rusted compressors, dripping coolant lines, and ever-humming vent fans in one forgotten pump station. A congregation kneels before a towering filtration unit, convinced that the constant thrum is a mechanical heart, listening to their pleas. What they found there would change everything for them. Not because the machine answered, but because it gave structure to fear. Criminal syndicates notice this devotion and adapt for the next 1,000 years. Crime lords have learned that belief can be more efficient than blasters. A local boss might quietly sponsor a cult that preaches obedience to appointed guardians in exchange for protection. Religious festivals become convenient covers for smuggling runs or recruitment meetings in an overcrowded plaza. A blessing of tools is also an excuse to hand out concealed weapons in a derelict freight bay. A supposed vigil for the lost masks, an initiation ceremony into a protection racket. It is faith repurposed as infrastructure. And yet, not all of it bends to corruption. In a place where the sky is a ceiling of metal, faith slowly turns inward away from stars and distant empires, and toward the simple miracle of surviving the next day with dignity. A shared meal at a shrine after a blackout, a whispered promise to help a neighbor repair a failing air filter. This act of mercy would reshape galactic history only in the smallest sense. But for those who live here, that is enough. And in the next sector of this descent, the beliefs that comfort the many will stand in stark contrast to the cold calculations of those who rule them. Slicers, signals, and shadow nets. The digital underworld. In the shadows beneath those small kindnesses, another economy hums a quieter current of power that does not flow through markets or shrines, but through cables, fiber, and forgotten relays. If territory is drawn in rusted durasteel and neon, then influence here is measured in signals, glitches, and the gaps between security feeds. This is the story of the digital underworld of Coruscant over time. The great galactic networks that bind the core worlds together cascade downward through the city world, but the descent is imperfect. The hollow net that reaches the surface, plazas arrives here in fragmentary echoes, lagging by minutes or hours. Entire channels vanish behind corporate filters or imperial firewalls, leaving only a patchwork of connectivity. Some levels receive pristine military traffic, but no civilian news. Others cling to a single ancient relay that flickers on and off with the power grid in that patchwork. The slicers thrive. Power corrupts. But what happens when that power is measured in access codes instead of armies? The answer in these depths is the slicer, crouched in a cramped alcove surrounded by scavenged consoles and droid parts. They slip through firewalls, reroute surveillance feeds, and forge ident codes that can turn a wanted enforcer into a clean freight handler for one crucial scan. What followed was an invisible war of intrusion and countermeasure fought across systems no patrol could ever fully map. Some sell their skills to syndicates, splicing into traffic control to clear a landing lane for a Black Sun freighter. Others quietly feed data to rebels siphoning troop manifests and patrol routes from Imperial archives. A single stolen schedule can buy protection for an entire block. A fabricated debt record can erase years of obligation to a hut or condemn a rival to sudden collection in these exchanges. Information becomes currency, and sometimes the only currency that matters around these lone slicers grow shadow networks. Encrypted message boards hidden in the sublayers of obsolete municipal servers pirate broadcasts that hijack abandoned frequencies and whisper through malfunctioning holoprojectors on forgotten platforms. There are localized data caches sealed inside rusting junction boxes or buried in the memory cores of droids that no longer remember their original programming. What they found there would change everything for those who know where to look. Lists of informants, partial maps of sealed transit tunnels, recordings of corporate scandals, long scrubbed from official archives. For thousands of years, the great powers of the galaxy have relied on armies, fleets, and the Force. Yet in these lower levels, power is quieter and more precise. A single access key can open more doors than a squad of enforcers. A single leaked holo recording can end a career or ignite a turf. Conflict between rival gangs, and over time, those who control the flow of signals through the endless cables and conduits overhead would shape the fate of entire sectors in the next descent. The crude violence of blasters and blades will seem almost simple compared to the silent calculations that direct them. Children of the lower levels, orphans, crews, and coming of age, far below the silent calculus of signal brokers and slicers, the consequences of their decisions play out in far smaller hands. The story of Coruscant's Underworld is not only about syndicates and cartels, it is also about the children who learn to read danger, the way others read star charts on the mid and lower levels. Childhood unfolds in corridors rather than courtyards. Narrow maintenance walks become playgrounds. Open grates and exposed conduits replace parks and plazas. A rushing burst of steam from a ruptured pipe is as familiar as a passing airspeeder. On the surface over time, young eyes learn to spot the faint shimmer that warns of a sudden power surge across a leaking cable. A misjudged step can mean a fall into a forgotten shaft, so balance and caution become second nature, long before any formal schooling. Many of these children sleep in cramped habstacks or abandoned transit cars. Others drift between shelters and storage rooms, semi-orphans with parents lost to factory accidents, to arrests during sweeps, or to off-world contracts that never quite end in such spaces. Blood ties matter less than shared survival. Peer groups form tight crews that function as surrogate families. Older youths teach the younger ones which alleys flood with coolant during storms, which food stalls will trade a bowl of broth for an hour of sweeping or dishwashing paths. Branch early in these depths, recruiters from local gangs and galactic syndicates watch the corridors carefully. A child who can slip unseen through a ventilation maze becomes a courier, a lookout, or in time a thief. What followed was a quiet sorting. Some are drawn into protection rackets or spice routes. Others find different mentors. A patient repair master in a rusted droid shop on level 1313 might take on an apprentice, showing them how to splice old motivators into newer shells. A vendor in a steaming noodle stall might teach not only recipes, but the intricate etiquette of dealing with enforcers and patrols. Rarely, a social program from the upper levels extends a thin thread downward, a scholarship to a higher level school, a vocational course in power grid maintenance held in a repurposed warehouse for a handful of children. This act of mercy would reshape galactic history by placing underworld-born minds into positions that touch starship traffic control, medical logistics, or even the fringes of the Senate bureaucracy. Through it all, their resilience expresses itself in small, quiet acts, in forgotten freight bays. Children assemble mismatched droid parts into companions or tools. A scavenged sensor here, a repurposed vocabulator there. They map safe routes between sectors, memorizing which turbo lifts stall and which stairwells shelter predators. Dangerous ledges become arenas for invented games where the penalty for failure is not only defeat, but a bruising reminder of gravity over time. Nearly every hardened bounty hunter, every syndicate lieutenant, and every anonymous mercenary once walked these same dim corridors as a child, absorbing the unwritten laws of the depths long before carrying a blaster. And somewhere ahead in the dark, another generation is already choosing its path. The next descent will reveal what happens when these lessons meet. Open war, voices in the gloom, street vendors, medics, and everyday heroes. What follows is not another tale of syndicate wars or Sith artifacts buried in forgotten transit tunnels. Instead, The descent pauses on quieter figures, the ones who hold the depths together while greater powers fight overhead. In these levels, the story of Coruscant's underworld is not only written in blaster fire, but in steam, spices, and whispered favors traded beneath failing lights. Deep in a maze of stores on a mid-level concourse stands a vendor who has outlasted 3 gangs, 2 construction booms, and the slow collapse of the ceiling overhead. For decades, the same narrow counter has been there, pressed against a Duracrete support column, its grill powered by a cable illegally tapped into an ancient grid. Workers from the Works District, enforcers from Black Sun, and wandering drifters from Ghost levels all queue in the same line. No questions about employers, allegiances, or credit's origins are asked. The only rule is simple: no fighting at the counter. Over time, that rule would shape more than one uneasy truce as rivals silently shared the same broth. Not far away, behind a rusted blast door marked as a defunct maintenance bay, another kind of lifeline operates. Unofficial medics and alleyway healers run cramped clinics lit by flickering strips and repurposed droid optics. Some once studied in respectable galactic institutions before debts or scandals pushed them down. Others learnt their craft on the job, stitching wounds from industrial presses and treating burns from faulty power couplings. They patch up blaster scoring from gang skirmishes and treat spice lung from cheap underworld product using sterilizers powered off jury-rigged generators and Bacta diluted far beyond regulation. In these rooms, the Force is not invoked, the Jedi are distant myths, and survival is a practical art. Between the stalls and the clinics move another group entirely informal leaders who never appear on official manifests. They organize repairs when a main conduit fails, convincing rival crews to share tools and guard shifts. They negotiate with local gangs, trading safe passage for access to water lines or promising that a certain alley will remain neutral ground. Sometimes they climb toward the surface, standing in echoing bureaucratic halls to argue that a failing support beam or a darkened transit hub must be addressed before catastrophe. What they found there would change everything only rarely. Instead of swift aid, they meet indifference and delay, learning that in the galactic capital, distance is measured not only in levels, but in attention. Yet even here, where power often belongs to the cruel, acts of quiet defiance persist during blackouts. Vendors hand out food that would spoil anyway, feeding families who cannot pay when enforcers abuse their authority. A medic might hide a fugitive patient behind stacked supply crates, falsifying records at great risk. A maintenance crew may lose a crate of parts, so a collapsing tenement can be reinforced without permits. One small stand might refuse service to a particularly brutal lieutenant. Knowing the cost, this act of mercy would reshape galactic history only in legends. But in the underworld, it reshapes a single block. Taken together, these voices in the gloom show that the depths are not only built on fear and exploitation. They are also sustained by stubborn kindness, passed hand to hand in the dark. And as the descent continues toward levels where law fails entirely, these fragile networks of care will be tested by open conflict and approaching war. Jedi, Sith, and the Force in the depths. As those fragile networks of care strain under open conflict, another presence presses in on the depths, an invisible tide that has flowed through this planet city since before the first Durasteel pillar was raised. That power is the Force, and in the underworld, its currents run dense and turbulent from the surface. The Jedi Temple appears to stand apart from this chaos, a serene spire of the light side, towering above the galactic traffic. But the story of the temple is also the story of corridors far below, where robed figures step out of turbolifts into air that smells of oil and fear, when kidnappings trace back to gang enclaves, or when a fugitive Force-sensitive vanishes into the shadows. The Order sometimes descends. What follows was never a grand war, only brief incursions, a single Jedi and a Padawan moving through astonished crowds in Level 1, 313 markets, blue and green blades, briefly igniting in cramped stairwells as blaster fire snaps against humming light. Often, these missions were rescues, a child with impossible reflexes, winning too many games of chance in a smoke-filled den, a quiet teenager whose nightmares predicted structural collapses before they happened. Sometimes the Jedi arrived in time, sometimes they did not. And over time, the underworld learned that distant legends in white and brown robes could appear without warning, walk through a storm of bolts, and then vanish upward into the glow. What draws them down so rarely is also what makes the depths powerful in the Force. Millions of beings packed into rusted towers, their lives layered for thousands of years. One generation building homes inside the abandoned factories of the last each leaving behind. Memories imprinted on duracrete and steel. Fear in riot-scarred alleys, hope in overcrowded clinics, anger in labor strikes, resilience in families that survive. Yet another blackout together. All of it presses into the invisible field that binds the city, where the light side flickers in small acts of mercy. The dark side coils in the places no census droid visits. Rumors speak of Sith remnants and lesser, darker depths renting forgotten warehouses near the Works District or sealed maintenance galleries below ghost levels. There they assemble crude laboratories fueled by stolen power cells and stolen lives, experimenting with alchemy or cybernetics, away from the temple's site. Desperate gangs provide easy recruits, an empire in miniature, born from hunger and promise. Not every Force sensitive in the depths is claimed by Jedi or Sith. Some remain anonymous. A dock worker who always steps aside a second before a failing crane crashes down a fixer whose uncanny luck in negotiations keeps entire blocks supplied with food and medicine in shuttered basements. Cult leaders light candles before ancient statues dug from pre-Republic ruins, chanting half-remembered phrases that accidentally brush against real currents of the Force. Their followers feel something, and in that feeling, faith hardens together. These unseen sensitives create a hidden constellation beneath the city. The temple archives remember only a fraction of their names, yet their choices would shape the quiet history of neighborhoods and gangs and families. For the next 1,000 years, the Force does not honor level numbers. It seeps through bedrock and permacrete, equally strong in the lowest sub-basements as in the high council chambers, above binding the forgotten lives of the underworld into the same vast pattern that guides heroes and tyrants on the surface. And in the sections ahead, that pattern will be twisted even further as open war finally reaches the depths. Disasters in the dark, fires, collapses, and silent cover-ups. As open war finally reaches the depths, its weapons are not only blasters and starships, but stress fractures and sparks in places never meant to withstand such strain. The Force may bind the galaxy together, yet in Coruscant's underworld, it often announces itself as a shudder in the deck plates or the distant roar of something breaking far below. Over time, the most common enemies here are not Sith or Jedi, but age and neglect. Electrical fires crawl through ancient conduits that have been patched and repatched since before the Republic's golden age. A single, overloaded junction on a forgotten grid can ignite a cascade of burning cable that races along ceilings and walls, turning a narrow corridor into a tunnel of dark orange flame. What followed was usually a blackout. Whole blocks plunged into shadow, while residents grab what they can and run toward the nearest stairwell. In other places, the danger arrives from above and below at once corroded support pylons that have held the weight of 1,000 rebuilt levels finally shear away, with a sound remembered for generations. One moment a cramped market hums with vendors selling bootleg power cells and recycled droid parts. The next, the floor tilts, shelves slide and an entire section of walkway peels off into the abyss, leaving only twisted durasteel hanging over a shaft that seems to have no bottom gas leaks, bring a quieter terror. Ancient utility lines snake through the dark, carrying volatile mixtures meant for factories that shut down centuries ago. A single spark from a jury-rigged generator or an illegal cooking burner can turn an enclosed hab block into a pressure wave of fire doors. Buckle, transparent steel shatters, and when the smoke clears a level that once smelled of oil and street food, now reeks of scorched metal and silence. Not every disaster is an accident in the shadows of Syndicate conflict. Explosions become messages. A precision charge placed on a load-bearing column can erase a rival stronghold without A formal declaration of war during the worst gang campaigns, entire tiers of Level 1, 313 have been collapsed on purpose, burying safe houses and cantinas beneath tons of rubble. Officials might blame a structural failure, yet survivors remember the timed detonations, the way the blasts rippled outward through maintenance tunnels that were never meant to carry that kind of power. The immediate aftermath is chaotic and strangely ritualized. Alarms fail more often than they work, so the first warning is usually a rising tide of footsteps. In the stairwells, parents shout names over the roar of the crowd, clutching children and small lockboxes that hold everything they own. Those who escape gather in neighboring levels, sleeping in transit hubs, abandoned factories, or under flickering hollows, while frantic searches begin for those who did not emerge. Every missing person becomes a story, repeated in whispers at makeshift supplies and crowded med stations, authorities facing budgets stretched thin across. A galactic capital often choose containment over compassion. Damaged sectors are declared unstable. Doors are welded shut. Blast shutters slam into place, and entire runs of corridor vanish from public maps. In theory, these zones are uninhabitable in practice. Some residents remain trapped inside, cut off from official routes, forced to carve new passages through service ducts and collapsed shafts. What they found there would change everything for them. Narrow pockets of survivable space, lit by stolen power lines, improvised gardens fed by leaking pipes, and communities that learn to move without making a sound. The scars of these events remain etched into both stone and memory. Collapsed bridges hang above open chasms. Stairwells end abruptly in fused metal, and certain turbolift doors are never opened because everyone knows what waits. Beyond, children grow up hearing the story of the night. The fires ran along the ceiling or the day. The market fell away beneath their elders' feet. Over time, these tales harden into superstition. Some corridors are said to be cursed. Some maintenance shafts are avoided at all costs. And in the sections ahead, the question will no longer be how the underworld breaks, but who has learned to weaponize those breaks on purpose. Culture under pressure, music, art, and stories of the levels. In a place where ceilings fall and corridors are whispered about as cursed, there is another force at work. Not the force that the Jedi study, but the quieter pressure of daily survival. What happens when that pressure has nowhere to go? It becomes culture, pushed sideways, instead of upward, flowing through sound color and story in ways the surface will never catalogue. On any given night, in a rust-stained cantina on level 1313, the underworld hums with improvised music. The official entertainment circuits rarely reach this far down, so bands assemble themselves from whatever can still hold a charge. A Rhodian with a cracked hololute, a human tapping rhythm on a repurposed protocol droid's chassis, a Deveronian running distorted power through an antique HoloNet receiver. What followed was an entire genre built from malfunction and echo over time. Hybrid styles emerge. Twi'lek Ryle folk rhythms braided with Corellian spacer shanties, Huttese club pulses stitched to Togruta choral drones, each community hearing fragments of home in the mix and claiming it as their own. Outside those doors, the walls themselves begin to sing in pigment blank. Durasteel becomes contested ground for meaning gang sigils, and territorial marks are only the surface beneath them. Murals spread across support pillars and sealed blast doors, a Trandoshan shrine to a clutchmate lost in a Black Sun turf conflict, a sprawling depiction of a drowned homeworld painted by refugees from a system strip-mined by some distant corporate empire. Whole corridors are held together psychologically by these images of saints, smugglers, and local legends. A faceless Jedi rendered in luminous paint standing between a crowd and an unseen threat, or a shadowy Sith figure fading into the cracks where the masonry has already given way. In cramped apartments and maintenance alcoves, another tradition holds the levels together. The story of the time before elders sit on overturned crates and recount the days when their parents lived, where real sunlight touched transparent steel windows. For thousands of years, those memories have been passed down, edited by blackout, famine, and war. Some tales are almost civic history stories of early construction crews trapped when new foundations sealed over old transit lines. Others drift into the supernatural ghost trains heard on abandoned rails, sealed levels where the air still moves, although the vents are dead. And always there are the quiet stories of brushes with power. A Jedi seen once in a riot, a red-bladed stranger on a forgotten platform whose presence left frost on every railing fashion in the underworld is forged from necessity, then sharpened into signal. Cramped spaces and unreliable climate control demand, layered clothing, short coats, and gear that will not snag on exposed conduit respirators and eye filters begin as protection against industrial haze, then become status pieces etched with family marks or gang crests, armor plates, scavenged from Clone War surplus, are repainted and chained into streetwear tattoos, map entire biographies across skin coordinates of a lost level, symbols of Syndicate allegiance, stylized renditions of the very murals that mark a person's block. Even body modification follows this logic. Subdermal emitters for emergency light, reinforced joints for climbing forgotten scaffolds, each change a record of where that body has been. It would be easy to read all of this as reflection of deprivation, but that would miss the point. Underworld culture is not a shadow of the surface. It is a deliberate answer to being rendered unseen in a galactic city that only celebrates its towers these songs, walls, stories, and bodies insist that the depths exist and have their own history. In the sections ahead, the question will no longer be whether this culture survives, but how those who rule the levels learn to bend it toward power, economies of debt, credits, favors, and owed lives in a place built on being unseen. Power takes on a quieter shape. It is no longer measured in star destroyers or Senate votes, but in numbers on a chip and in names on a mental ledger. The story of the Underworld's economy is not about wealth, it is about who is allowed to breathe without asking permission on the lower levels. Formal banking exists, mostly as rumor. Most residents will never stand beneath the soft glow of a Republic credit kiosk. Instead, their currency moves through small glowing credit chips, passed from hand to hand in cramped corridors. Pawn shops become the closest thing to institutions. Cracked, transparent steel cases filled with scavenged data pads, heirloom blasters, and family jewelry. Each item is a story of something traded away to cover one more day's rent. Local moneylenders operate from back rooms and repurposed storage units. Their rates are brutal, their records flawless. What follows was an entire culture bound together by debt. Rent arrears pile up in buildings where the landlord has not been seen in person for years. Faceless, holding companies on the surface own the towers, but in practice, it is gangs and syndicates that collect payment when a child falls from a broken walkway or a worker is crushed in an illegal factory. Medical droids do not arrive for free. The bill is quietly attached to a family name, and the interest begins to grow gambling dens on levels such as 1313. Promise, escape in flickering neon. Yet every lost hand ties another thread between the player and the house over time. These threads form chains. Some are obvious, a Black Sun enforcer standing in a doorway until a payment is made. Others are invisible. A favor granted years ago in a forgotten alley, suddenly called in. When a syndicate needs an extra pair of hands for a weapons shipment on a ghost level, repairs are traded for food. A mechanic keeps a failing generator alive in exchange for a week of meals. Information is bought with protection. A stall owner gains a lookout in return for warning a local gang when off-duty security patrols drift too close. In this shadow economy, favors become a parallel currency. There are those who learn to navigate it with almost Jedi precision, becoming brokers of trust and reputation. A bartender who never forgets a debt, a courier who never loses a package. Their names travel farther than they do. And what they found there would change everything for those who depend on them. Yet, for every quiet broker, there are many more crushed under obligations that can never truly be repaid. Children inheriting a parent's debt, entire blocks, effectively owned by a single predatory lender. In the end, freedom in the depths is rarely about locked doors. A being might cross half the galactic city without once seeing daylight and still be less trapped than the neighbor who cannot refuse the next job because a hand rests on their shoulder, reminding them of what is owed. In the sections ahead, that hand will gain faces as the gangs, cartels, and hidden empires that manage this web of obligation step into view. When the surface notices, media, myths, and misunderstandings in the glittering daylight of the upper levels, the underworld exists mostly as an image, an easy nightmare projected on smooth, transparent steel screens far above the smog. Down there in the quiet apartments of the mid and high tiers family, watch looped holonews segments that claim to reveal the truth of the depth. What follows was never meant to be a full picture, only a warning on those channels. The story of the lower levels becomes a parade of sirens and sensationalism. A single shootout on level 1313 is replayed from 6 angles, while a commentator speaks of endless gang war, a collapsed transit. Tunnel in the Works District is framed as proof that the foundations themselves are failing. Entire sectors are reduced to a few names: Black Sun, Crimson Dawn, Hutt cartels. The result is a monolithic portrait of darkness, where every alley is a murder scene and every shadow hides a Sith over time. Upper-level residents build mental maps out of these fragments. They tell their children never go below this level, as if an invisible line in the air marks the border between civilization and chaos. They speak of whole districts as if they belong entirely to one syndicate. That sector is all Black Sun. Only bounty hunters survive down there. In reality, the boundaries shift block by block, but in the imagination of those who never descend, the underworld hardens into a single forbidden zone. These perceptions do not remain private fears. They move upward into policy debates in the Senate rotunda, and in Coruscant security briefings, calls for crackdowns echo through the chamber proposals appear to seal off. More levels to flood certain shafts with surveillance droids to grant broader powers to task forces that already treat the depths as hostile territory. Occasionally, a different holofeed runs a charity special, showing hungry children beneath flickering lights. Donations are collected for relief programs that treat entire neighborhoods as distant victims rather than complex communities down below. The reaction is rarely simple anger. It is a quieter mix of frustration and dark humor. In crowded cantinas on 1313 residents watch themselves turned into cautionary tales. A mechanic who spends long nights rerouting illegal power taps hears commentators describe her street as uninhabitable. A food stall owner serving skewers beside a rusted support column becomes part of the background in a dramatized holodrama about bounty hunters. What they found there would change everything. The narrator promises, but the faces on screen are composites drawn by those who never walk the real corridors yet. Even through the distortion, something unintentional slips through the endless focus on danger, admits that there is power here, that the underworld matters enough to fear and to mythologize. And for listeners who have followed this descent level by level, the myths begin to thin. The shadows reveal apartments, workshops, shrines, and stories that would shape far more than a single scare segment. In the next section, the gangs and hidden empires behind those headlines will step into view, and the question will become who truly rules the dark beneath the galactic city. Cycles of descent and ascent. How? Levels rise, fall, and rise again in the shadow of those hidden empires. Another pattern slowly emerges beneath the headlines and the holonet myths. The underworld itself moves in cycles. Entire levels rise and fall, then rise again under different names and different masters, but with the same narrow streets and the same recycled air. The story of a single district becomes a quiet echo of the galactic city above centuries before the Clone War. A mid-tier industrial level near the works thundered with foundries and droid assembly lines. Its designation changed on bureaucratic schedules, but residents called it by the name of the largest factory, a monolithic concern whose logo glowed over the main transit hub. When the plant closed, after a trade conflict, the level slid into unemployment and debt. What followed was slow decay. Warehouses became tenement blocks, conveyor belts turned into walkways, and the old safety catwalks became new homes for those pushed down from the surface. Over time, the same level was rediscovered by investors from the upper city who saw opportunity in its rusted gantries and neon alleys. They branded it as an authentic night sector, a place where the danger of the underworld could be consumed in curated doses. New holo theaters opened in refitted loading bays, and a retired ore elevator was turned into a panoramic lift for visitors seeking a controlled descent into the dark. But when fashion shifted and profits thinned, the attention moved on, leaving half-finished projects and hollowed-out clubs behind the level sank again, this time not into industry, but into a quieter neglect infrastructure, often served as the spark for these brief ascents. A new turbo-lift spine tied a forgotten band of levels directly into a major sky traffic route. A corporate transit hub anchored an entire ring of platforms. For a generation, that corridor felt almost central. Gangs were pushed outward, vendors paid formal rent, and for a while the light side of the city's economy reached downward. Then a new hyperspace lane or a political decision redirected freight elsewhere, and the same node became a bypassed cul-de-sac, its bright signage flickering above empty platforms. Yet the people remained, and their memory did not reset with each redesign. Residents still spoke of the old smelter block long after the furnaces were stripped away. Grandparents told stories of a time when from that very balcony the sky could be seen, before higher superstructures sealed it behind transparent steel and duracrete. A child might walk past a cracked blast door and hear that once it opened onto a Republic-era shuttle bay, now bricked over and repurposed as stacked housing. This generational memory would shape how each wave of change was received. Some welcomed corporate credits, while still distrusting off-world managers. Others treated visiting thrill-seekers as temporary weather to be endured. Underworld communities adapted with a resilience that rarely appeared in official records when industry died. Scrap guilds emerged when transit shifted. Smugglers mapped new routes when crime syndicates tightened their grip. Neighbors formed quiet, mutual aid networks in the shadows of those larger powers seen across centuries. The underworld ceases to be a static pit. It becomes a living system, constantly compressed by decisions made in Senate chambers and corporate towers, yet also reshaped from within by those who refuse to leave. In the next section, those persistent communities will step forward, and the question will become how ordinary residents bend gang rule and hidden empires around their own fragile survival. The underworld's shadow on the saga ties to familiar events. Over time, those fragile lives in the depths begin to brush against the grand events told on holodramas and in Jedi archives. Power struggles on the surface cast long shadows, and those shadows fall first on the underworld. The story of the galactic saga is never only written in throne rooms and war rooms. It is also traced in cramped alleys and flickering tunnels beneath Coruscant's glow. During the final days of the Republic, Jedi descend from the temple's serene halls into crowded lower streets in pursuit of assassins and informants. What appears on screen as a brief chase through neon canyons is in truth a collision between ancient orders and communities that have endured for thousands of years. When Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker pursue a shape-shifting killer through packed sky lanes and smoky clubs, they pass vendors born on forgotten levels and patrons whose families have never seen true daylight. Their presence would shape rumors carried back to the surface stories of Jedi sabers, igniting in places the Council rarely acknowledges in the same era. Bounty hunters move through level 1, 3, 1-3, and neighboring districts as if through a hunting preserve. Black Sun lieutenants and Hutt enforcers stalk targets down rusted catwalks. Senators who speak of justice in the Senate sometimes descend in disguise into Cocoa Town or the Works District meeting brokers in back rooms where the air tastes of coolant and recycled smoke. Their alliances are forged over unregistered datapads and untraceable credits, and what followed was a quiet redirection of entire campaigns. A single shipment diverted here, a name erased from a registry there, and distant battlefields. Change before a shot is fired. Hidden among these dealings are the anonymous, many background figures, glimpsed for a heartbeat, beside heroes and villains, a droid mechanic who patches a damaged speeder before a crucial chase, a server in a Uscrew district nightclub who overhears a fragment of Sith plotting a dockhand in the industrial depths who loads a crate that will later arm rebels or crush them. Each crosses paths with legends, then vanishes again into the crowd. Their lives continue in the half-light, while the Holonet remembers only the famous even. As the Republic falls and the Empire rises, the pattern endures. Imperial agents recruit informants from the lowest levels. Resistance cells hide among abandoned transit tunnels and ghost levels where official maps have given up. What they found there would change everything for the new regimes, forgotten shrines to earlier conflicts, sealed bunkers filled with obsolete weapons and communities who remember how to disappear when empires change. Banners after Endor and through each new order that claims Coruscant, the underworld remains, it adapts, absorbs and remembers for the next 1,000 years of shifting power. It will continue to trade information, shelter fugitives and quietly steer outcomes from the shadows. The underworld is not a footnote to galactic history. It is a continuous, unseen thread woven through every era, waiting beneath the surface of the saga, settling into the dark, summing up the city. Beneath the city. Through that unseen thread, the descent can be traced again in memory from the very top of the world down to the places where the city gives way to stone and shadow above. The shining spires and open sky lanes still glitter in the artificial day. Starships threading between towers while the Jedi temple's vanished silhouette lingers as an absence in the skyline beneath that. The entertainment districts and bright hollows of Uskru and Cocoa Town pulse with color, promising distraction to those who never wonder what lies below their feet. Deeper still, the Works District and the industrial veins of Coruscant take over, heavy machinery grinding on through endless shifts, furnaces and refineries feeding power upward to palaces, senatorial apartments, and starship berths further down. The light bends and fractures in crowded bazaars where Level 1, 313, and its neighboring strata blur into a maze of stalls, cantinas, and back alleys, each one hiding a story of smuggled spice, stolen identities, or quiet deals that would shape events far above and at the lowest remembered depths. The city itself begins to break apart into ancient caverns, collapsed transit tunnels, and fragments of pre-Republic architecture where natural rock and forgotten foundations share the same stale air over time. A pattern emerges in this descent, a sense that the story of Coruscant's underworld is not a straight line, but a stack of lives and ruins laid, one atop another. Each layer holds the remains of an older era, from the first sinkholes and infrastructure projects to the abandoned habitats sealed off when the surface rose higher and higher. There are ghost levels where corridors end in rubble or in welded bulkheads, places where entire neighborhoods have fallen through and been rebuilt on the wreckage below. And yet, life continues to thread itself through those gaps in these depths. Crime and community exist side by side. Syndicates, such as Black Sun, the Pike networks, and whatever Hutt or Crimson Dawn remnant claims a block may control spice routes, weapons caches, and information channels. But in the same corridors, families cluster in cramped housing, vendors run stalls off illegal power taps, and children grow up knowing only the dim glow of jury-rigged street lamps. There is conflict here, and there is danger. Yet there is also a quiet endurance, a refusal to vanish, even when the galactic spotlight never reaches this far down the scale of it all, stretches beyond any single account. Thousands of levels, from the highest traffic lanes to strata so low, their numbers have been stricken from official maps, hold countless corridors, stairwells, shafts, and maintenance ducts. Even a whole night spent wandering in imagination through cantinas, droid shops, forgotten shrines, and natural caves would only brush the surface of what followed, was only one thin path through an endless tangle of possible stories, through republics, empires, and new republics. The underworld persists, the names of regimes change, Jedi and Sith rise and fall, starfleets clash in distant war, but the foundations of Coruscant remain in place, adapting, absorbing, and enduring in its own slow rhythm. It is a place of continuity, where the same tunnel that once carried workers to ancient construction sites now guides fugitives, refugees, and scavengers by the same faint emergency lights. What they found there would change everything for them, yet the tunnel itself simply continues, another artery in a city that never truly sleeps. As the journey settles into memory, details begin to soften individual gangs, specific districts. The precise numbers of levels all blur into a single impression of dim corridors and distant echoes, of muffled traffic from far above and the hum of improvised generators close at hand in that softened view, Coruscant's underworld becomes less a catalogue of locations and more a steady presence beneath the galactic capital, an enduring murmur under the roar of history, waiting, unchanged in its essence, no matter how many times the surface is rebuilt, drifting through the levels, a guided descent into sleep. In that softened view, the city beneath the city becomes a place not of pursuit and escape, but of distance and perspective. The roar of the surface fades into a distant echo, and in its place another sound emerges, a steady mechanical heartbeat running through durasteel veins carrying power, air and memory down through the strata of Coruscant. Imagine a slow turbo lift, sealed and quiet, its transparent steel walls dim to a comfortable glow level. Numbers drift past in pale Aurebesh, 51841 7322, each one a little further from the burning light of the Skylanes, each one another step away from the urgency of the Senate chambers and the Jedi temple above. With every soft chime, the descent continues downward, deeper, quieter around the mid-levels. The underworld's more familiar landmarks begin to pass by the doors without opening a distant balcony. Hints at the neon haze of level 1313, once an industrial zone now remembered for bounty hunters and criminal syndicates. But here, its holograms are muted through layers of transparent steel, their colors reduced to a gentle blur. The story of that level's violence remains outside, contained and remote. The turbo lift glides on, past a quiet market, sunk into an old transit concourse. Stalls closed for the cycle-hanging fabrics, barely stirring in recycled air. What followed was not a chase or a deal, but simply stillness crates stacked in careful rows, improvised power lines humming softly overhead. No crowd, no conflict. Only the suggestion of lives lived at a slower pace, far from the galactic spotlight. Deeper still, the numbers fall into triple digits. Then double an abandoned maintenance tunnel appears beyond the glass, a ribbon of darkness threaded with faint guidelights. This is the infrastructure that would shape everything above. Forgotten conduits, old repulsor tracks, sealed bulkheads leading to ghost levels, collapsed and merged over time. Here, the city's skeleton shows through, yet even this feels distant, safe, contained behind the quiet hum of the lift. There is no Sith here, no Jedi, no open war, only the long, patient work of gravity and age, pulling sound and tension upward, leaving the depths unhurried down here. Time stretches out. Alarms do not ring. Comlinks do not demand answers. Decisions can wait for the next 1,000 years. If they must with each passing level, another layer of strain loosens, shoulders unclench. Breathing falls into rhythm with the soft mechanical pulse. Downward, deeper, quieter. The endless city outside becomes an echo, and the descent begins to mirror an inward journey. What they found there would change everything, not in battle or revelation, but in the realization that beneath the galactic capital's storms, there is room for stillness, for the mind to sink as the lift sinks, until the underworld and the inner landscape are the same vast, humming darkness, gently holding the drift towards sleep. The lights above, the lights below. Closing the circle and looking ahead outside becomes an echo, and the descent begins to mirror an inward journey. What they found there would change everything, not in battle or revelation, but in the realization that beneath the galactic capital's storms, there is room for stillness, for the mind to sink as the lift sinks, until the underworld and the inner landscape are the same vast humming darkness, gently holding the drift towards sleep. Power defines worlds. But what happens when that power is seen not from a window in a tower, but from far above the sky? From orbit, Coruscant is a sphere of light, a seamless shell of glittering points spread across the night side of the planet. At first glance, it appears uniform, a perfect city world without shadow. But the story of this world is more complicated. Every light on the surface has an answering glow, buried deep below a maintenance lamp on an old transit platform, a neon sign in a level 1313 cantina, a single apartment window in a forgotten housing block. Over time, the image resolves the bright avenues around the Senate, and the Jedi Temple become only one band in a layered halo of illumination. Beneath those districts, the work still burns with industrial fires. The USCRU entertainment sector throws up its restless colors, and still deeper, the underworld's jury-rigged grids flicker to life. Illegal taps humming in conduits laid thousands of years ago, each trembling. Light marks a life, a story, a hidden corner that would shape the planet as surely as any decree passed in the Senate chamber. Seen this way, the underworld completes the picture of Coruscant, not only a capital of politics and Jedi, but a vertical world of workers tending reactors, wanderers moving between ghost levels, criminals guarding spice routes, and caretakers keeping ancient pumps alive, while empires rise and fall. Above what followed was not a clean division of dark side and light side, but a constant exchange. Freight haulers from the depths supplying the surface, festivals, surface dwellers slipping down to Uscrew or Cocoa Town and never quite coming back. For thousands of years, governments have claimed Coruscant Republic, Imperial New Republic, and beyond. For the next 1,000 years, other banners may fly. Yet below the surface, the same unbroken thread continues. Ancient foundations poured over sinkholes, repurposed into cisterns, then into shelter, then into home-abandoned infrastructure, turned black market artery. Forgotten transit lines reborn as smuggling routes. The hum of the underworld does not end when a war does. It simply changes pitch. There are other worlds that hold such hidden layers, other ecumenopolises, other mining planets whose shafts became cities, other stations whose maintenance rings turned into neighborhoods on another quiet night. The descent might trace the alleys of Nar Shaddaa, the pressure domes of Bespin, or the drowned lower decks of a forgotten imperial shipyard, each with its own faint constellation of lives burning against the dark. For now, the lift in the mine slows the levels, blur together, until Coruscant is again only a distant sphere of lights hanging in the void surface and underworld. One continuous glow. The conflict above softened the murmurs below, reduced to a steady, almost tidal sound. The farewell here is not a closing door, but an open silence, a space to drift either into sleep or into quiet thought while somewhere far away. The underworld of Coruscant still hums patiently in the dark,